Hey guys, tonight's subject is one that can sound strangely distant at first, almost abstract, until you remember that for most people in the medieval world, pain was not an interruption to life. It was part of life. Expected, endured, interpreted, and very often carried quietly through ordinary days. So in this story, we are not just looking at disease in some dramatic, plague-filled sense, but at the far more constant reality of aching teeth, infected cuts, weak stomachs, damaged joints, troubled births, poor sleep, and the long companionship of discomfort. As always, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history to fall asleep to, you're very welcome to subscribe. To begin, it helps to set aside the modern idea that illness arrives, gets diagnosed, and is then treated within a clearly organized medical system. For most medieval people, the body was understood in a very different way, and pain was rarely a clean, separate event. It was woven into weather, work, food, faith, age, season, and status. It could be explained as imbalance, as punishment, as misfortune, as environment, or simply as the ordinary burden of being alive in a fragile body. And that is where this documentary really begins. Not just with what hurt, but with why pain was so constant, and why the people living through it often understood it in ways that now feel unfamiliar, but made deep sense at the time. A great deal of modern imagination tends to divide medieval suffering into two extremes. On one side, there is the romantic image of castles, monasteries, candles, and richly colored cloth. On the other, there is the more dramatic picture of pestilence, filth, and spectacular catastrophe. But daily life for most people sat somewhere much quieter, and in some ways more unsettling between those two. The hidden reality was not simply that disease existed. Of course it did. It was that discomfort was ordinary enough to be almost background noise. A person might live for years with pain in the back from field labor, pain in the mouth from rotting teeth, pain in the belly from uncertain food or parasites, pain in the skin from irritation or infection, and pain in the joints from cold and repetitive work. That kind of suffering did not always produce a memorable crisis. More often, it produced endurance. And endurance mattered because medieval life offered relatively few ways to escape the body. There were remedies, certainly, and practitioners of many kinds, from learned physicians to surgeons, monks, apothecaries, midwives, herbal healers, and local wise women. But even where care existed, it was uneven, expensive, uncertain, or limited by distance. Much depended on who you were. A wealthy noble with servants, privacy, better food, and access to literate medicine inhabited a different physical world from a plowman, a laundress, or a laboring mother who could not afford to rest. This is one of the first important truths to keep in mind. Medieval illness was never only biological. It was social. The same fever, wound, or difficult pregnancy could unfold very differently depending on shelter, diet, status, and whether anyone could pause their work long enough to care for the sick. Even the simple act of avoiding injury was harder than modern viewers may instinctively assume. Many tools were sharp, heavy, or crude by present standards. Fire was everywhere in domestic life. Animals were close at hand. Water could be dangerous to fetch and difficult to carry. Floors could be damp, streets muddy, stairs uneven, buildings smoky, and labor repetitive in the extreme. A modern person might think first of famous epidemics, but a small cut on the hand, if poorly timed and poorly healed, could become a serious event. So could a blister, a boil, a cough that deepened in winter, or a toothache that moved from nuisance to torment. One of the stranger lessons of the medieval body is that what sounds minor to us could become major very quickly, not because people were foolish, but because the margin between irritation and danger was narrow. Pain in the mouth, for instance, was probably among the most intimate and miserable experiences of ordinary life. Teeth wore down, gums became inflamed, infections could spread. Diet varied by region and class, but coarse bread could include hard fragments from grinding, and constant where mattered over time. Sugar was not yet the universal destroyer it would later become, but poor dental health did not need modern sweets to flourish. A damaged tooth could mean sleepless nights, difficulty chewing, foul taste, swelling, fever, and a kind of loneliness that anyone who has suffered dental pain will recognize at once. There were remedies: rinses, poultices, herbal preparations, extractions if one could bear them or pay for them. But none of these restored a person to a pain-free modern baseline. For many, the realistic goal was not cure. It was relief enough to continue. The same was true of the stomach, which in the medieval world was under constant negotiation with scarcity, spoilage, fasting, overwork, and contamination. Grain could fail. Ale could be safer than bad water in some contexts, but quality varied. Salt preserved food, though not perfectly. Fresh produce depended on season and access. Meat was unequally distributed. The result was not one universal medieval diet, but a broad pattern of nutritional uncertainty. Some people ate enough in quantity but not in balance. Others did not eat enough at all. And when the body is underfed, almost every ailment worsens. Wounds heal more slowly. Illness lingers longer. Cold bites deeper. Fatigue becomes a permanent atmosphere rather than a passing condition. This is where a modern listener may begin to sense the full texture of medieval pain. It was not only the sharp pain of an accident or the sudden pain of disease. It was also the dull pain of deficiency, weakness in winter, dizziness after labor, breathlessness after climbing, the sore heaviness of limbs that had never properly recovered. A mother nursing a child while half depleted herself. An old man continuing to work because there was no comfortable category called retirement into which he might disappear. The body was used hard, repaired imperfectly, and then used again. And yet the medieval world was not blind to bodily patterns. In some ways, it watched them more closely than we do, simply because there were fewer instruments standing between sensation and interpretation. Learned medicine, especially in Latin Christendom, often rested on the theory of humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with particular qualities. To a modern mind, humoral theory can seem quaint or mistaken, but it served as a structured attempt to explain why bodies differed, why seasons mattered, why age changed a person, and why treatment should not always be identical for everyone. It encouraged people to ask not just what hurts, but what kind of person is hurting, in what climate, after what food, during what season, at what stage of life. That way of thinking could lead to ineffective treatments, certainly, but it could also produce something more rational than caricature allows. An understanding that health depends on a whole web of conditions. That broader view shaped everyday advice. Sleep, diet, exercise, bathing, sexual activity, emotional state, and the surrounding air could all be discussed as part of health. This is one of the quieter reversals in the history of medicine. Medieval people were not simply waiting in darkness for modern science to rescue them. They were trying, with the intellectual tools available, to observe regularities in the body and live accordingly. Sometimes they got it badly wrong. Sometimes they noticed something real but explained it differently. And sometimes, hidden beneath theories we no longer accept, there sat a practical wisdom about moderation, rest, and environment that still feels recognizable. For ordinary people, however, theory mattered less than whether pain stopped them from working. The field laborer with an inflamed knee could not spend long reflecting on bodily balance if grain still needed gathering. The washerwoman with cracked skin and aching wrists still faced water, cloth, weight, and cold. The blacksmith, the carpenter, the servant carrying fuel, the cook bent over heat, the shepherd walking long distances in bad weather, all belonged to professions that slowly wrote themselves onto the body. Medieval pain was occupational in a way that modern life still understands, though usually in softer form. Repetition stiffened shoulders, lifting damaged backs, cold swelled joints, poor light strained eyes, smoke troubled lungs. Workplaces were not separate from homes in the way many are today, which meant the body never fully left its risks behind. And the home itself could be a place of illness. Indoor smoke was a constant companion in many dwellings, especially where ventilation was poor. Eyes watered, throats scratched, chests tightened. Bedding might be shared, worn, damp, or alive with insects. Fleas, lice, and parasites were not signs of moral failure in the simple way later centuries sometimes imagined. They were facts of life in a world without modern laundering systems, insect control, sealed interiors, and endless hot water. Skin complaints, itching, irritation, and secondary infection were not unusual embarrassments. They were part of domestic reality. Sleep, too, was less innocent than candlelit nostalgia suggests. Nights were dark, yes, but not always restful. Pain disrupted sleep. Cold disrupted sleep. Hunger disrupted sleep. Fear did too. Fear of theft, fire, weather, childbirth, debt, and the next failed harvest. A listener today may think of medieval evenings as naturally tranquil, but tranquility is difficult when your body hurts and tomorrow's labor begins early. The body lying down on straw or rough bedding does not become peaceful simply because the room is lit by firelight. In fact, one of the cruelest features of chronic pain in any age is how it follows people into the one part of the day supposed to offer relief. Women, of course, carried a distinct burden of pain that structured whole portions of life. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and repeated pregnancy in harsh conditions created layers of strain that records often glimpse only imperfectly. A noble woman and a peasant woman faced different material circumstances, but neither entered childbirth in a risk-free world. Midwives possessed experience and practical knowledge, but outcomes could turn suddenly. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, stillbirth, and maternal death were woven into the emotional landscape of families and communities. This is another hidden reality. Medieval pain was not only personal, it was communal. Illness gathered witnesses. Women attended births. Neighbors brought food. Priests were called. Children watched adults weaken. The household learned how fragile its arrangements really were. Children, too, lived close to illness. Many did not survive infancy or early childhood, and those who did were not protected by a separate padded universe. They encountered disease, hunger, injury, and labor early. To modern sensibilities, this can feel almost unbearably harsh, yet it also meant medieval people understood vulnerability from the beginning of life onward. A sore throat, a rash, a feverish child in a cold room. These scenes were heartbreakingly familiar, and the emotional force of them should not be underestimated simply because death was more common. Familiarity with mortality did not erase grief. It merely made grief structurally ordinary. If all of this sounds relentlessly bleak, it is worth pausing at an important point of balance. Medieval people were not only sufferers, they were also interpreters, adapters, and caretakers. They built routines around frailty. They shared remedies. They prayed, observed, rested when possible, and made judgments about which pains were alarming and which were survivable. The body's misery was not the whole of life, but it was rarely far away. And as we move deeper into this world, the next question becomes even more revealing. When pain could not be avoided and cure was uncertain, who was trusted to treat it? What exactly did treatment look like? And how much of medieval medicine was stranger, harsher, or more sensible than modern imagination usually allows? That question leads into one of the most revealing parts of the medieval experience, because treatment was rarely a single clear profession, a single building, or a single, recognized path. It existed instead in layers. A household might begin with its own knowledge first because it had to. A mother, grandmother, servant, or neighbor might know which herbs were used for a swollen gum, which broth was thought suitable for weakness, which compress might draw heat from an inflamed limb, or which prayer should be said when ordinary remedies seemed to fail. The first response to illness was often local, practical, and immediate, shaped by what was on hand and by what generations of people believed had worked before. Only beyond that domestic level did other figures come into view. In towns and cities, there might be physicians trained in university medicine, men who had read authorities from the ancient and Islamic worlds, who could discuss humors, pulses, urine, seasons, and the logic of regimen. But learned physicians were not available to everyone, and even when they were not the only option. Surgeons occupied a different space, often more manual, more physical, and sometimes lower in prestige than those who practiced learned medicine, though indispensable all the same. They dealt with wounds, fractures, abscesses, ulcers, bleeding, and the visible violence of the body when something had already gone badly wrong. Barber surgeons, in some places, combined grooming with practical procedures, a pairing that sounds odd now only because modern medicine has divided the world so neatly. To medieval people, these boundaries were less fixed. The important question was not what title a person held in some future professional hierarchy, but whether they could help. Monasteries and religious houses could also become places of care, though here too modern assumptions need some adjustment. They were not hospitals in the contemporary sense, and the word hospital itself could describe institutions that offered hospitality, shelter, charity, and care in varying degrees. Some provided support to the poor, the elderly, travelers, or the sick. Some were better organized than others. Some offered more spiritual comfort than medical intervention. Yet, in a society where illness could easily become isolation, the existence of any institution that recognized bodily need mattered. It reminds us that medieval care was never only about cure. It was also about attendance. Someone to wash a patient, change bedding, bring broth, pray at the bedside, or witness the struggle of dying was part of treatment too. This becomes even clearer when we look at what diagnosis actually meant. A physician could not order blood tests or imaging. He had only the patient's body as it presented itself. Complexion, breathing, appetite, heat, stool, sleep, pulse, and especially urine, which was widely examined for clues about internal state. To modern ears, urine diagnosis can sound comical, one of those familiar signs that the medieval world was guessing in the dark. But it is worth being fair here. Observation was one of the few tools available, and careful observation can still tell a great deal, even if the theory used to interpret it is incomplete. Color, smell, sediment, frequency, and pain all mattered. The mistake was not that medieval practitioners looked for patterns. It was that the explanatory framework surrounding those patterns often directed them toward remedies that could harm as much as heal. Among the most famous of those remedies was bloodletting, and few medieval practices have been remembered with quite the same combination of fascination and horror. It is easy to picture it as mindless cruelty, but that would miss why it endured. Within humoral thinking, excess blood, or imbalance among the humors more generally, could produce a wide range of symptoms. Letting blood was meant to restore proportion, to reduce heat, pressure, or congestion in the body. Sometimes it was timed carefully according to season, age, or astrological considerations. This sounds alien now, but it belonged to a larger intellectual system that tried to make the body legible. And if a patient felt temporarily lighter or calmer afterward, as some might, that could reinforce belief in the practice. The darker truth, of course, is that a treatment can make sense within its own logic and still leave people weaker. In a world where many patients were already undernourished, exhausted, or recovering from infection, The removal of blood was not necessarily a kindness. Here again, the hidden reality is less theatrical than popular imagination suggests. Medieval medicine was not a parade of outrageous procedures inflicted on everyone at random. More often, it was a series of sincere attempts to manage pain with limited knowledge, mixed outcomes, and a great deal of uncertainty. People were not merely victims of bizarre beliefs. They were making difficult choices in the absence of better options. Herbal medicine occupied another large part of that landscape, and unlike some of the more dramatic interventions, it often emerged from repeated contact with plants, seasons, and bodily effects. Infusions, salves, oils, poultices, and syrups were used for wounds, coughs, sleep troubles, digestive complaints, and skin conditions. Not every remedy worked. Some certainly did little beyond offering ritual comfort, but others may have had genuine soothing, antiseptic, laxative, or anti-inflammatory properties, even if users described them in very different language. Honey, vinegar, wine, animal fats, and various herbs all appeared in medicinal contexts. What matters is not to romanticize these treatments as secretly modern, nor to dismiss them entirely. Medieval healing often lived in that uncomfortable middle ground where empirical habit, inherited authority, symbolism, and practical necessity overlapped. The treatment of wounds reveals this mixed world especially well. A cut, puncture, or crush injury could happen in fields, workshops, kitchens, roads, or battles. The first task was usually obvious. Stop the bleeding, clean what could be cleaned, bind what could be bound. But cleanliness itself had a different meaning before germ theory. Water might rinse dirt away without removing danger. Cloth could protect or infect. Ointments might soothe, seal, or trap contamination. A wound that looked manageable at first could redden, swell, heat, and throb over the next days. Pus might appear. Fever might follow. The smell would change. Pain deepened from surface sting into deeper distress. And this was often the point where fear truly began. Not because medieval people were ignorant of infection, in the modern technical sense, but because they knew from experience that some wounds turned treacherous. Surgical intervention, when it came, could be grimly physical. An abscess might need lancing. Dead tissue might be cut away. Broken bones might be set with varying degrees of skill. Cautery, the use of heat to burn and seal tissue, was known and used. To modern listeners, this can sound unbearable, and in many cases it surely was. Pain relief existed in limited forms, sometimes with alcohol, herbal sedatives, opiates in certain contexts, or preparations meant to dull sensation, but nothing like a reliable, controlled anesthetic environment stood waiting in the background. The patient's own endurance, the speed and confidence of the practitioner, and the willingness of others to hold the body still all became part of the procedure. It is difficult not to feel a kind of quiet awe, mixed with sorrow, at what people were expected to bear while remaining fully present inside themselves. And yet medieval people did not necessarily divide treatment into the categories we might instinctively choose. Scientific on one side, spiritual on the other. A prayer to a saint, a relic placed nearby, a pilgrimage undertaken in hope of healing, or a vow made during illness did not automatically signal irrationality to those involved. These actions responded to the emotional and existential dimensions of pain. If disease could strike unpredictably, if a child could decline despite careful nursing, if a mother could die in childbirth while a careless man survived a winter fever, then purely material explanations did not always feel sufficient. Religion provided narrative, meaning, and a language for suffering. Sometimes it also structured practical care through monasteries, confraternities, or charitable institutions. One of the more subtle misunderstandings modern audiences often carry is the idea that spiritual interpretation somehow distracted medieval people from practical treatment. Often the opposite was true. A family might pray intensely and still send for a surgeon. A patient might wear an amulet and also drink a bitter preparation prescribed by a healer. People layered responses because life required it. Uncertainty rarely encourages purity. It encourages accumulation. When the stakes are high, most human beings, in any century, reach for every kind of help they think might matter. Pain also had a moral and social dimension. The ability to endure it patiently could be admired. Complaint, depending on status and gender, might be judged differently. Some pain was visible and publicly acknowledged. Some remained private, especially when tied to shame, intimacy, or bodily functions. A nobleman with gout might receive sympathy and attention. A poor laborer with chronic pain might simply slow down and keep going until slowing down was no longer possible. Women's pain, especially around reproduction, could be treated as both serious and ordinary, which is to say deeply consequential and yet insufficient to interrupt expectation. The body could suffer greatly without society deciding that such suffering was exceptional. There is a particularly revealing contradiction here. Medieval society was in many respects more physically intimate with pain than modern life. Childbirth happened at home. Bodies were washed, laid out, and buried by known hands. Illness unfolded in front rooms rather than disappearing into professional institutions. Children saw sickness. Neighbors heard coughing through walls. The dying were not hidden away as easily. And yet familiarity did not produce comfort. It produced literacy in suffering, if we can call it that, without reducing the fear. People recognized the signs. They knew the smell of a bad wound, the look of a dangerous fever, the exhaustion of a woman near term, the rattle in an old person's chest. That knowledge did not save them from grief. It simply meant grief arrived in recognizable forms. The poor were, unsurprisingly, the most exposed to the harshest outcomes. Charity existed, but it did not erase structural weakness. A day laborer weakened by fever might lose wages immediately. A household that depended on one able body could tip toward hunger if that person was injured. The sick poor did not merely suffer their symptoms. They suffered the economic consequence of having symptoms at all. Here, medieval pain becomes inseparable from medieval precarity. To be ill was often to become more vulnerable to every other danger. Debt, hunger, abandonment, cold, displacement. This is why even relatively minor ailments mattered so much. In a secure modern life, a strained back may be miserable but survivable. In a fragile agrarian household, the same injury could threaten the whole rhythm of subsistence. Even among the privileged, however, pain had a way of stripping glamour away from status. Court life, for all its ceremony, did not protect against kidney stones, digestive distress, infected teeth, chronic skin disease, insomnia, melancholy, or the humiliations of aging. Richer people could buy better care, but not invulnerable bodies. They too submitted samples for inspection, endured restrictive diets, swallowed unpleasant compounds, sat through bleedings, feared epidemics, and worried about heirs, pregnancies, and reputations weakened by illness. In this sense, pain was one of the great reminders that medieval society, though sharply hierarchical, rested on bodies that all bled, decayed, and fatigued. This is also where the emotional experience of chronic illness becomes easier to imagine. A medieval person with recurring pain did not have access to modern language about inflammation, depression, trauma, autoimmune disease, or neuropathy, but they still had recurring pain. They still had bad days and better days. They still learned to anticipate weather changes in their joints or fear certain foods, seasons, and forms of labor. They still negotiated the small sorrow of not being able to do what once seemed easy. It is tempting to think that without modern diagnostic categories, such experiences were somehow less psychologically vivid. In truth, they may often have felt lonelier, because explanation remained partial and the future remained obscure. There were conditions that attracted particular dread. Stones in the bladder or kidneys could be agonizing. Skin diseases could isolate and stigmatize. Leprosy, though often misunderstood in modern popular imagination, carried a distinctive moral and social weight depending on time and place. Fevers that returned again and again suggested something both stubborn and beyond control. And then there was the world of epidemic disease, which hovered at the edge of ordinary illness even before the great catastrophes most people immediately think of. Medieval communities were used to sickness moving through households and villages, though not always with the same scale or notoriety later associated with plague. The line between private suffering and public crisis could be thinner than it first appeared. But before we move into the great shared terrors of epidemic life, it is worth lingering a little longer in the smaller room, beside the more ordinary bed, because some of the most revealing truths lie there. Imagine not the dramatic patient in a chronicle, but a woman with a persistent cough through winter, a mason whose shoulder never healed properly after a fall, a child with worms and stomach cramps, an elderly man whose eyesight dims in a world where almost everything depends on seeing clearly enough by poor light. History often preserves kings, battles, and disasters, yet the medieval world was also full of these quieter biographies of discomfort. And once we begin to see that, the scale of suffering changes. It is no longer only about famous outbreaks or exceptional procedures. It becomes about the sheer number of people who woke each day already carrying something that hurt. That cumulative burden shaped temperament, family life, work rhythms, and even religious imagination. A person who expected pain did not necessarily live without joy, but they lived with a different baseline of bodily uncertainty. Relief, when it came, may have felt more precious precisely because it was never guaranteed. A warm room, a tolerable night's sleep, the easing of swelling, a child's fever breaking by morning, the return of appetite after days of weakness. These were not small things. They were reprieves, and perhaps that is one reason medieval records, for all their limitations, can sometimes sound so attentive to bodily change. Improvement was meaningful because decline was so familiar, and looming above that whole world of ordinary ailment was the question every community eventually had to face. What happened when pain stopped being individual, when the sickroom widened into the street, when rumor traveled faster than explanation, and when people already accustomed to hardship began to sense that something larger and stranger was moving toward them? That sense that something larger and stranger was moving toward them did not arrive all at once. And that is important because epidemics in the medieval world were rarely experienced first as neat historical events with names and dates attached. They began instead in fragments. A traveler looked more exhausted than usual. A neighbor's child developed a fever and did not recover on the expected timetable. A cluster of households in one lane seemed suddenly quiet. Bells rang more often. The local healer was called too many times in the same week. News traveled not through public health bulletins, but through gossip, market conversation, clerical letters, merchant rumor, and the private mathematics of fear. People counted funerals. They noticed who had disappeared from church, from the fields, from the road. For communities already accustomed to ordinary illness, this made epidemic disease peculiarly difficult to read in its early stages. Medieval people were not unfamiliar with fevers, coughs, swellings, fluxes, rashes, or sudden deaths. The body failed often enough in daily life that a new wave of sickness did not instantly declare itself as something unprecedented. It had to accumulate first. Only after enough familiar symptoms began producing unfamiliar patterns did the mood change. This is one of the quietest but most unsettling aspects of epidemic history. Catastrophe often entered the medieval imagination gradually, wearing the face of ordinary illness until the numbers, the speed, or the character of suffering forced people to recognize that they were no longer dealing with the usual burdens of life. Once that recognition began, the emotional atmosphere of a town or village could change very quickly. Everyday habits, previously unremarkable, became charged with suspicion. A cough in the market no longer sounded merely unpleasant. A household door kept closed for too many days suggested danger. A stranger arriving from another district might be watched with a new and uneasy concentration. And yet these shifts did not occur in a world equipped with firm microbiological explanations. People searched for patterns through the intellectual and religious frameworks they had. Some looked to weather, corrupted air, foul smells, unlucky conjunctions, divine displeasure, seasonal imbalance, or tainted matter. Others looked to human causes, sometimes with terrible consequences, because fear has always had a talent for turning uncertainty into accusation. The medieval idea of miasma, of corrupted or diseased air, is often remembered as an error, which in technical terms it was. Disease did not spread because bad smells themselves carried moral poison through the atmosphere. But to dismiss the theory too casually is to miss why it made intuitive sense. Medieval people had eyes, noses, and experience. They saw that illness often thrived where waste accumulated, where the air felt close and foul, where bodies were crowded, where heat and rot seemed to thicken together. They did not know about bacteria or fleas or viral transmission, but they did know that corruption in the environment often seemed to accompany corruption in the body. So when epidemics gathered force, responses aimed at purifying air, carrying herbs, burning fragrant substances, avoiding certain places, or fleeing urban density did not feel absurd to those making them. They felt like coherent attempts to survive. And survival, even at its most practical, quickly revealed the brutal arithmetic of medieval inequality. To flee an infected town required somewhere to go, transport to get there, and resources to remain away. The wealthy could sometimes retreat to country estates or safer houses. Clergy of rank, merchants with networks, noble households, and officials with means could imagine movement as strategy. The poor had fewer exits. A laborer whose livelihood depended on urban work, a widow with children, an apprentice tied to a master, or a servant whose place in the world was already precarious could not simply step outside the path of disease. This is where the hidden reality of medieval illness becomes even more socially stark. Epidemic suffering was shared, but not evenly distributed. Exposure followed the familiar lines of crowding, dependence, hunger, and obligation. Within the home, epidemic fear intensified everything already difficult about ordinary care. One family member sick with fever or vomiting might still be nursed closely. But when several began to fail in succession, the household itself could become unstable. Who fetched water if the strongest body was confined to bed? Who prepared food if the cook was ill? Who sat with the dying if the living feared infection? The answers varied, and often the answer was simply that someone did it anyway, because affection, duty, and necessity overrode fear until fear became impossible to ignore. Medieval households could not maintain sterile distance. Rooms were too shared, labor too interdependent, and privacy too limited. Epidemics moved through intimacy because intimacy was unavoidable. This is one reason epidemic disease was not only a medical event but a crisis of social texture. The rhythms of trust that make daily life possible began to fray. People who would normally gather at church, trade at markets, borrow tools, sleep in shared spaces, or help wash the bodies of the dead found those customs altered by danger. The sick could become both objects of pity and sources of dread. The dead demanded burial, but burial itself might expose mourners. Priests were needed, but priests could fall ill. Bells marked loss, but repeated bells created their own kind of suffocating soundscape. In a small community, the repetition of grief could turn time strange. Mourning brought another rumor, another death, another absence, and by evening the old normality already felt distant. If we move toward the most famous medieval epidemics, especially the Great Plague waves of the 14th century and beyond, it is important not to let notoriety flatten experience. The Black Death has become so iconic that it sometimes overwhelms the quieter complexities of what people actually saw, smelled, feared, and did. To later generations, plague can appear almost mythic, a sweeping symbol of medieval misery. But to those living through it, it was not a symbol. It was a succession of horrifying specifics. A swelling in the groin or under the arm, a fever rising too quickly, a relative unable to stand, dark marks on the skin, delirium, thirst, panic, breathlessness. The speed with which yesterday's healthy neighbor became tomorrow's corpse. And beneath all of that was the unnerving collapse of expectation. Illness was supposed to follow certain recognizable patterns. This moved too fast. That speed mattered psychologically as much as physically. Medieval people were used to pain. They were used to lingering weakness, uncertain recovery, children dying, wounds festering, mothers laboring dangerously, elders declining. But plague introduced a scale and tempo that unsettled even a world already familiar with suffering. Chronic pain can be woven into daily life. Epidemic death, especially when sudden and concentrated, tears daily life apart. Households could lose multiple members within days. Clerics writing about the experience often struggled to capture the sheer emotional dislocation, the sense that familiar bonds of care were buckling under the force of events. Some accounts emphasized courage and devotion, others terror and abandonment, and likely both were true in different places, or even in the same street at different moments. It is also worth resisting the simple image of medieval society descending into total chaos. Human communities rarely collapse in one single emotional direction. Alongside panic, there was organization. Alongside selfishness, there was service. Authorities tried to regulate burials, movement, markets, and sanitation according to what they believed might help. Religious processions were sometimes organized, though in certain circumstances gathering could worsen danger. People made wills. They distributed goods. They prayed together or separately. They nursed kin. They fled when they could, stayed when they must, and interpreted what was happening through every available lens. This is one of the reasons plague history feels so haunting. It reveals not only death on a massive scale, but the varied and deeply human attempts to remain socially recognizable while the ordinary fabric of life was being pulled apart. The handling of the dead became one of the most visible signs that illness had exceeded normal limits. Medieval communities were accustomed to death rituals. Bodies were washed, watched, prayed over, buried with some degree of ceremony according to means and circumstance. Even poor funerary customs had form, but epidemic mortality strained these forms. Graves multiplied, timing shortened, familiar rites could be reduced, altered, or hurried. The emotional wound here was not only loss itself, but the loss of the usual way of honoring loss. To die badly was one thing. To be buried too quickly, without expected prayer, gathering, or care, was another layer of disturbance altogether. Medieval Christianity had given enormous significance to the good death, to preparation, confession, and ritual passage. Epidemics could rob people of that imagined order. And yet, even here, one must be careful with exaggeration. Not every town experienced the same breakdown in the same way. Not every account of carts piled with bodies or universal abandonment applies evenly across regions and years. The medieval world was vast, varied, and temporally uneven. Some places were devastated more severely than others. Some institutions functioned longer. Some communities adapted better. What matters for our purposes is not to force a single story of plague upon every locality, but to appreciate how epidemic illness exposed the pressure points already present in medieval life. Overcrowding, fragile food supply, limited medical understanding, intense religious interpretation, and the dependence of households on a few functioning bodies. The effects were not merely demographic, though they were certainly that. Epidemic disease also changed the meaning of ordinary pain. After great mortality, a cough could sound different. A swelling could feel newly ominous. Communities that had once read illness as tragic but routine now carried memory in the body. Fear lingered. It traveled into future outbreaks, into rumor, into household precautions, into sermons, into municipal policy. The past did not stay past. Once a population had seen how quickly sickness could widen from one bed to many, everyday signs of bodily trouble acquired a heavier emotional charge. This is one of the subtler afterlives of epidemic history. It teaches people to reinterpret sensations that once seemed ordinary. That altered interpretation affected medicine as well. Practitioners wrote more, observed more, argued more urgently about causes, contagion, corrupted air, and regimen during epidemic times. Authorities in some cities developed increasingly organized responses over the later medieval and early modern periods, including forms of quarantine, inspection, and movement control that would have seemed extraordinary in quieter centuries. Here there is another expectation reversal worth noting. We sometimes imagine the medieval world as static in the face of disease, condemned to repeat inherited ideas. Some of the most interesting developments emerged from practice rather than theory. Merchants noticed routes of spread. Port authorities observed that ships could bring invisible trouble before anyone on shore fully understood what had arrived. Town leaders learned, imperfectly, that delay could be deadly. The result was not modern epidemiology, but a growing repertoire of civic responses. Isolation of the sick, regulation of goods, inspection of arrivals, emergency burial arrangements, and temporary restrictions on gathering. These measures were uneven and often contested, but they reveal something easy to miss in the larger story. Medieval people were not simply passive before disease. They watched, inferred, and adapted, even if the intellectual map guiding them was incomplete. And still, for most ordinary people, the epidemic experience returned finally to the scale of the body. The large systems of response mattered, but what they actually felt was thirst, weakness, swelling, heat, dread, and the particular loneliness of being too ill to help the others in the room. This is why everyday pain and epidemic pain belong in the same story. One prepared people for the other, and one magnified the meaning of the other. A medieval peasant who had lived for years with sore joints, bad teeth, digestive distress, and winter coughs already knew the body as vulnerable territory. Epidemic disease did not introduce vulnerability. It intensified it beyond familiar limits. As without adjustment. In reality, crisis often produced experimentation. Not always correct experimentation, and not always humane, but attempts nonetheless to notice what kinds of movement, contact, or environment seem to worsen danger. Some of the most interesting developments emerged from practice rather than theory. Merchants noticed routes of spread. Port authorities observed that ships could bring invisible trouble before anyone on shore fully understood what had arrived. Town leaders learned, imperfectly, that delay could be deadly. The result was not modern epidemiology, but a growing repertoire of civic responses. Isolation of the sick, regulation of goods, inspection of arrivals, emergency burial arrangements, and temporary restrictions on gathering. These measures were uneven and often contested, but they reveal something easy to miss in the larger story. Medieval people were not simply passive before disease. They watched, inferred, and adapted, even if the intellectual map guiding them was incomplete. And still, for most ordinary people, the epidemic experience returned finally to the scale of the body. The large systems of response mattered, but what they actually felt was thirst, weakness, swelling, heat, dread, and the particular loneliness of being too ill to help the others in the room. This is why everyday pain and epidemic pain belong in the same story. One prepared people for the other, and one magnified the meaning of the other. A medieval peasant who had lived for years with sore joints, bad teeth, digestive distress, and winter coughs already knew the body as vulnerable territory. Epidemic disease did not introduce vulnerability. It intensified it beyond familiar limits. There is another emotional layer here that is easy to miss from a distance. In a society where God, sin, providence, and divine judgment framed so much of reality, large outbreaks could provoke not only fear of death but fear of meaning. Why this household and not that one? Why the child first and the stronger father later? Why did prayer seem answered for some and denied for others? Why did apparently wicked people survive while devout ones died? Medieval people were capable of living with mystery, but epidemics enlarged mystery into a public wound. Sermons and religious writings tried to interpret what was happening, but explanation could soothe only so much when bodies kept failing. In this sense, epidemic disease was also a crisis of confidence in the intelligibility of the world. And yet life did continue, which may be the most quietly astonishing fact of all. Fields were eventually replanted. Market stalls reopened. Children were born into households that had recently buried their dead. Marriages were made in the shadow of fresh memory. Work resumed, not because grief had finished, but because subsistence demanded motion. Medieval societies had a harsh capacity for continuation. That continuation did not erase trauma. It simply folded trauma into the next season. A person who survived plague or recurrent epidemic years did not step back into innocence. They carried forward a changed understanding of how swiftly ordinary life could be interrupted. That changed understanding also affected how people thought about the vulnerable among them. The old, the frail, the poor, the chronically ill, pregnant women, and children whose small bodies could not bear prolonged stress. In quieter times, such people already faced disproportionate danger. In epidemic times, their fragility became painfully visible. And here the story bends back toward the intimate scale once more, because the medieval history of illness was never only about spectacular mortality. It was also about long weakness after survival, about the body that did not die but did not fully return either, about convalescence in households with little spare food, little warmth, and no guarantee that tomorrow's labor could wait. A fever broken was not always a body restored. A mother might survive childbirth and remain depleted for months. A laborer might recover from infection only to discover that strength had thinned, appetite changed, and old endurance no longer held. An elderly survivor of epidemic seasons might not die of plague and yet live thereafter in a narrower, more fragile physical world. Recovery, in the medieval sense, could be partial, uncertain, and socially inconvenient. The sick person was expected, when possible, to rejoin necessity. But what happened when necessity demanded more than the recovered body could now give? That question, in many ways, opens the next layer of medieval pain. Not the drama of sudden disease, but the long afterlife of bodily damage, disability, aging, and the difficult art of living on in a world that offered very little softness to those who no longer moved through it with ease. That question, in many ways, opens the next layer of medieval pain. Not the drama of sudden disease, but the long afterlife of bodily damage, disability, aging, and the difficult art of living on in a world that offered very little softness to those who no longer moved through it with ease. For a modern audience, this may be one of the hardest realities to hold in view for any length of time, because so much of modern medicine is built not only around saving life, but around extending function, reducing chronic pain, and creating environments in which damaged bodies can still move with a degree of independence. Medieval society could do some of this in limited ways, but not much of it, and not consistently. A person who survived a badly healed fracture, an infected wound, a stroke-like event, failing sight, or the cumulative strain of hard labor did not re-enter a world shaped around accommodation. They re-entered the same world as before. Heavy tools, uneven roads, smoky rooms, narrow stairs, cold mornings, and work that continued to demand from the body exactly what the body could no longer easily give. Not always correct experimentation, and not always humane, but attempts nonetheless to notice what kinds of movement, contact, or environment seemed to worsen danger. Some of the most interesting developments emerged from practice rather than theory. Merchants noticed routes of spread. Port authorities observed that ships could bring invisible trouble before anyone on shore fully understood what had arrived. Town leaders learned, imperfectly, that delay could be deadly. The result was not modern epidemiology, but a growing repertoire of civic responses. Isolation of the sick, regulation of goods, inspection of arrivals, emergency burial arrangements, and temporary restrictions on gathering. These measures were uneven and often contested, but they reveal something easy to miss in the larger story. Medieval people were not simply passive before disease. They watched, inferred, and adapted, even if the intellectual map guiding them was incomplete. And still, for most ordinary people, the epidemic experience returned finally to the scale of the body. The large systems of response mattered, but what they actually felt was thirst, weakness, swelling, heat, dread, and the particular loneliness of being too ill to help the others in the room. This is why everyday pain and epidemic pain belong in the same story. One prepared people for the other, and one magnified the meaning of the other. A medieval peasant who had lived for years with sore joints, bad teeth, digestive distress, and winter coughs already knew the body as vulnerable territory. Epidemic disease did not introduce vulnerability. It intensified it beyond familiar limits. There is another emotional layer here that is easy to miss from a distance. In a society where God, sin, providence, and divine judgment framed so much of reality, large outbreaks could provoke not only fear of death but fear of meaning. Why this household and not that one? Why the child first and the stronger father later? Why did prayer seem answered for some and denied for others? Why did apparently wicked people survive while devout ones died? Medieval people were capable of living with mystery, but epidemics enlarged mystery into a public wound. Sermons and religious writings tried to interpret what was happening, but explanation could soothe only so much when bodies kept failing. In this sense, epidemic disease was also a crisis of confidence in the intelligibility of the world. And yet life did continue, which may be the most quietly astonishing fact of all. Fields were eventually replanted. Market stalls reopened. Children were born into households that had recently buried their dead. Marriages were made in the shadow of fresh memory. Work resumed, not because grief had finished, but because subsistence demanded motion. Medieval societies had a harsh capacity for continuation. That continuation did not erase trauma. It simply folded trauma into the next season. A person who survived plague or recurrent epidemic years did not step back into innocence. They carried forward a changed understanding of how swiftly ordinary life could be interrupted. That changed understanding also affected how people thought about the vulnerable among them. The old, the frail, the poor, the chronically ill, pregnant women, and children whose small bodies could not bear prolonged stress. In quieter times, such people already faced disproportionate danger. In epidemic times, their fragility became painfully visible. And here the story bends back toward the intimate scale once more, because the medieval history of illness was never only about spectacular mortality. It was also about long weakness after survival, about the body that did not die but did not fully return either, about convalescence in households with little spare food, little warmth, and no guarantee that tomorrow's labor could wait. A fever broken was not always a body restored. A mother might survive childbirth and remain depleted for months. A laborer might recover from infection only to discover that strength had thinned, appetite changed, and old endurance no longer held. An elderly survivor of epidemic seasons might not die of plague and yet live thereafter in a narrower, more fragile physical world. Recovery, in the medieval sense, could be partial, uncertain, and socially inconvenient. The sick person was expected, when possible, to rejoin necessity. But what happened when necessity demanded more than the recovered body could now give? That question, in many ways, opens the next layer of medieval pain. Not the drama of sudden disease, but the long afterlife of bodily damage, disability, aging, and the difficult art of living on in a world that offered very little softness to those who no longer moved through it with ease. That question, in many ways, opens the next layer of medieval pain. Not the drama of sudden disease, but the long afterlife of bodily damage, disability, aging, and the difficult art of living on in a world that offered very little softness to those who no longer moved through it with ease. For a modern audience, this may be one of the hardest realities to hold in view for any length of time, because so much of modern medicine is built not only around saving life, but around extending function, reducing chronic pain, and creating environments in which damaged bodies can still move with a degree of independence. Medieval society could do some of this in limited ways, but not much of it, and not consistently. A person who survived a badly healed fracture, an infected wound, a stroke-like event, failing sight, or the cumulative strain of hard labor did not re-enter a world shaped around accommodation. They re-entered the same world as before. Heavy tools, uneven roads, smoky rooms, narrow stairs, cold mornings, and work that continued to demand from the body exactly what the body could no longer easily give. This is where survival itself begins to look different. We tend to imagine survival as the opposite of tragedy, and often it is. But in the medieval world, survival could be painful, diminished, and uncertain. A man whose leg healed crooked after a fall from a cart might live for many more years, but each year would be marked by imbalance, swelling, altered gait, and dependence on others during bad seasons. A woman who survived a difficult birth might carry lasting weakness in the back, the pelvis, or the abdomen, not as a dramatic crisis, but as a quiet reordering of everyday life. A soldier returning from war with a hand damaged, a shoulder stiffened, or an old wound reopening in damp weather did not enter a support system designed to restore him. He entered memory, limitation, and work. This brings us to one of the gentler but more revealing misconceptions about the medieval body. People sometimes assume that because medieval life was harsh, it must also have been bluntly indifferent, as though communities simply ignored the injured, the aged, and the physically impaired. That is too simple. Families cared. Neighbors noticed. Monastic houses and charitable institutions could offer support. Guilds, kin networks, and parishes sometimes provided forms of relief, however uneven. The problem was not that no one cared. The problem was that care took place within narrow material limits. Compassion existed in a world that still required firewood to be carried, bread to be made, fields to be worked, and rents to be paid. Affection could not abolish labor. Pity could not make a bad leg strong again. So a great deal of medieval disability was negotiated inside the household. A woman with impaired vision might be given work that could be done by touch or familiarity. An elderly man who could no longer reap might watch animals, mend smaller tools, or supervise children. A child with a lasting bodily weakness might remain on the edge of full adult labor for years, contributing in irregular ways. These accommodations were often practical rather than ideological. They did not arise from a formal philosophy of inclusion. They arose because communities knew the bodies they lived with. A person was not only their injury, they were still a daughter, a father, a servant, a brother, a widow, a neighbor. And once again, medieval life reveals its strange combination of hardness and intimacy. The same society that could expose people to relentless physical suffering could also know very precisely how each familiar body had changed. Aging, in particular, takes on a different texture in such a world. Modern listeners often think of old age in terms shaped by pensions, retirement, assisted living, spectacles, hearing aids, heated interiors, pain medication, and the possibility, at least in principle, of stepping back from heavy labor. Medieval old age had very little of that cushioning. To grow old was not merely to become wise or frail in an abstract sense. It was to experience the body as a set of losses unfolding within a demanding material environment. Teeth were lost, hearing dimmed, sight weakened, especially in poor light, hands stiffened, knees thickened and pained, breath shortened, sleep became more fragile, digestion changed, skin dried and thinned. Yet the practical needs of life often did not shrink in proportion. This is one reason medieval writings on age can sound both respectful and unsentimental. Old age was recognized, morally and socially, as a distinct stage of life. It could even be granted a certain dignity, particularly in religious or familial settings. But it was also understood as bodily decline. Learned medicine, through humoral thinking, often associated old age with coldness and dryness, a body less vigorous, less moist, less balanced, and therefore more vulnerable. However flawed that explanatory language may seem now, it did at least acknowledge something true. The elderly body could not withstand strain, cold, hunger, or disease in the same way as the young. And because medieval people lived closer to those transitions, they saw the shift clearly. The old person in the room was not merely older by number. They were differently exposed to the world. The seasons could sharpen that exposure mercilessly. Winter, especially, must be imagined not as a picturesque interval of frost and candlelight, but as a long negotiation with pain for anyone already weakened. Dampness entered bones. Hands cracked. Chest ailments worsened. Mobility shrank. Fuel shortages brought cold indoors. Thick walls did not necessarily mean warm rooms. A chronic cough in winter was not just unpleasant. Could become exhaustion, lost sleep, and a slow slide into something more dangerous. The elderly poor suffered this most visibly, but not exclusively. Even in wealthier houses, chronic pain and weakness did not vanish simply because more cloth or better food was available. Privilege softened exposure. It did not remove embodiment. What emerges here is a quieter kind of documentary truth. Medieval pain was not always loud. It was often repetitive. Morning stiffness, the ache of standing, the humiliation of needing help fastening clothes, climbing steps, or carrying even small weights, the fear of falling, the fear of becoming a burden. These are profoundly human experiences, and one of the reasons this history still reaches modern viewers so directly is that it strips away the comforting illusion that the past was occupied only by dramatic deaths and exceptional cruelty. Much of it was made instead of recognizable, lingering discomfort. And for some, that discomfort crossed into more visible disability. A person might be lame from birth or injury. Another might lose an eye, a hand, part of a foot, or functional strength after illness. Deformity, whether congenital or acquired, altered not only movement but social perception. Medieval society could attach symbolic meanings to bodily difference, sometimes charitable, sometimes suspicious, sometimes moralizing. Religious culture offered models of pity, charity, and spiritual value, but social life could still be harsh. A body that moved strangely, looked altered, or could not work normally might attract attention that was not always kind. It is important, though, not to collapse all medieval disability into stigma. Many impaired people lived integrated lives within households and communities that knew them well. The closer the social world, the more an individual could be understood not only as a visible difference, but as a familiar person with a place. This is especially true when we consider the economy of skill. Not all useful labor required the same physical capacity. A person with limited mobility might still spin, mend, sort, watch, count, teach a child a prayer, keep track of household objects, prepare smaller foods, or do forms of craft work that demanded patience more than speed. This does not mean medieval life was broadly accessible in a modern sense. It was not, but it does complicate the idea that injured or aging people simply disappeared from usefulness. In a pre-industrial household economy, many small forms of contribution mattered, and because survival often depended on using every available hand, eye, memory, and habit, communities could be more adaptive than the harsher stereotypes allow. Yet adaptation had limits, and those limits became most visible when pain was invisible. A visibly broken body could at least be recognized as altered. Chronic pain without obvious outward sign was another matter. The woman who seemed slow because her joints burned. The man who looked able-bodied but was exhausted by recurrent internal pain. The aging worker whose back seemed fine until lifting began. Medieval people certainly knew that unseen suffering existed, but social tolerance for it could vary sharply. The body was expected to perform as long as it could. Failure without clear external cause might be interpreted through moral language, temperament, laziness, melancholy, weakness, or divine trial. In this respect, the medieval world was not so different from many later societies. Pain that cannot be clearly measured often invites judgment. Melancholy itself occupies an interesting place here, because emotional suffering and bodily suffering were not neatly separated. A person weighed down by grief, fear, despair, exhaustion, or long illness did not step into a different category called mental health. These experiences were folded into humoral balance, spiritual struggle, temperament, and physical condition all at once. A widow who lost children to disease, a man broken by recurring pain, a nun exhausted by fasting and sleeplessness, an elderly person isolated by weakness, all might be understood as spiritually or bodily disordered in ways that crossed our modern categories. This matters because medieval pain was not just felt in wounds and joints. It was also felt in mood, in sleep, in appetite, in heaviness of mind, in the inability to imagine relief. Quiet sorrow and bodily suffering often lived in the same room. There is also the question of smell, which modern audiences rarely dwell on for long, but which shaped medieval illness and recovery more than we instinctively remember. A body in chronic distress can smell different. So can infected wounds, poor digestion, unwashed bedding, old age, incontinence, or fevered rooms. In a world with close domestic quarters and far fewer barriers between bodies, these sensory details were part of how pain was known. Caregiving was intimate partly because it had to cross those boundaries. To nurse someone was not only to see them weakened, but to smell the sick room, to empty vessels, to change cloths, to notice the breath, the sweat, the sourness of a wound or the dryness of the mouth. That intimacy could deepen tenderness, but it could also deepen fatigue. Medieval caregiving was physical in a way modern institutional care often distributes across systems. And caregiving itself created pain. A wife lifting her husband, a daughter turning an elderly mother in bed, a servant carrying water again and again for someone with fever, a priest or religious attendant sitting through the night beside a dying patient. These acts cost strength, sleep, and time. In communities already living near the edge of subsistence, the body of the caregiver could begin to fail under the burden of care. So even here, illness was rarely private. It radiated outward, redistributing labor, draining food, altering routines, and silently changing the health of those who remained upright. This becomes especially poignant in the case of long recovery. We often imagine pre-modern illness as either fatal or brief, but many medieval people likely moved through extended periods of convalescence. Not bedridden enough to be treated as dying, not healthy enough to resume normal effort. This in-between state is one of the least celebrated and most exhausting human conditions in any age. To be recovering without fully recovering, to be expected back at work because the crisis has passed, while the body still trembles with weakness, is its own kind of suffering. Medieval recovery might involve broths, lighter foods where available, rest if possible, warming, prayer, and patience. But patience is harder to maintain when rent, harvest, and domestic obligation continue their own clock. Even bodily repair could be painful in ways that now feel distant. Teeth lost were not replaced. Eyes dimmed were only partly aided, and only for some by rudimentary lenses in later periods. Hernias, ruptures, and prolapses might be bound, managed, or hidden, but seldom elegantly solved. Hearing loss altered social life without any reliable device to soften the drift into misunderstanding and withdrawal. Skin conditions remained visible. Scars stayed prominent. The medieval body wore its history openly. Modern medicine often hides the trace of injury, shortens convalescence, or gives language that makes suffering feel legible. Medieval life often offered none of those comforts. The mark remained, the pain remained, and the explanation remained partial. There is an unexpected dignity in that, though not a romantic one. It is simply the dignity of people continuing under conditions that did not flatter them. An old woman still sorting grain with bent fingers. A former laborer pausing more often on the road but still making the journey. A half-healed worker finding a new rhythm with a damaged hand. These are not grand historical scenes, but they are part of what history really was. The past was inhabited not only by kings on horseback and monks with manuscripts, but by bodies reorganizing themselves around loss. Religion continued to offer one language for making sense of such lives. Pain could be read as trial, purification, imitation of Christ's suffering, punishment, mystery, or simply the burden of fallen existence. For some, this gave endurance shape. It did not remove agony, but it embedded agony in a larger moral universe. There is a risk, of course, in overstating this consolation. Not every sufferer was serene. Not every chronic pain was spiritually transformed. Irritation, anger, fear, resentment, and despair must have been common, even if less often preserved in formal sources. Still, the religious frame mattered because it allowed pain to mean something other than useless malfunction. That did not cure the body, but it could alter the emotional weather in which the body was endured. And yet meaning itself could fray under repetition. A person who prayed for relief and received none, who recovered from one illness only to be overtaken by another, who watched strength diminish year after year, might well experience a more exhausted form of faith, one less triumphant and more stubborn. Medieval spirituality, in that sense, was not only made in moments of revelation. It was made in the tedious persistence of discomfort, in the sore knees of prayer, in the breathlessness of climbing to church, in the dull headache after fasting, in the long night beside a coughing child. The sacred and the painful were often neighbors. If we shift our attention slightly, another revealing pattern comes into view. The way status altered not whether people suffered, but how that suffering was narrated and managed. Elite bodies were described more often in writing, but not always more truthfully. Noble pain might be wrapped in decorum, translated through physicians' notes, household records, or pious accounts. Poor pain often went unrecorded unless it disrupted order, entered legal testimony, or drew charity. So the medieval archive itself is uneven, heavier with some bodies than others. This means that much of everyday pain must be reconstructed indirectly, through medical texts, devotional literature, legal fragments, skeletal remains, building conditions, diets, tools, and the logic of labor. The result is humbling. The more closely historians look, the more they tend to find not a few isolated episodes of suffering, but a whole physical background of ache, risk, and strain. Skeletal evidence, where it survives and is studied carefully, often confirms what written records only suggest. Joints show wear. Bones reveal healed fractures, repetitive stress, nutritional insults, dental damage, infection, and the hard grammar of physical work. A spine can carry the history of labor long after the person's name is forgotten. Teeth can record diet and deficiency. Limbs can preserve the memory of imbalance or overuse. It is one of the quiet ironies of history that bodies which were once synonymous in life may tell us some of the clearest truths in death. They reveal that ordinary pain was not merely imagined from gloomy texts. It was inscribed physically into the people who lived it. And as we begin to see those traces more clearly, the medieval world becomes, in some ways, less exotic and more intimate. The distance of costume, language, and custom remains, but beneath it lies something recognizably human. People adapting to bad backs, failing teeth, weak eyes, troubled sleep, old injuries, long recoveries, and the slow narrowing that comes when the body no longer obeys as it once did. The difference is that they adapted without most of the small mercies modern life now considers unremarkable. Which raises another question that draws us even closer to the center of daily experience. If illness and pain were so constant, if recovery was incomplete and aging often harsh, then how did medieval people actually structure the ordinary habits of cleanliness, comfort, diet, and bodily maintenance that stood between them and even worse suffering? Because here, too, one of the most persistent modern assumptions begins to wobble. The medieval world was not simply careless about the body. It often cared intensely, though in ways shaped by very different resources, anxieties, and ideas of what keeping a body well was supposed to mean. It often cared intensely, though in ways shaped by very different resources, anxieties, and ideas of what keeping a body well was supposed to mean. That point matters because few myths about the medieval world are repeated more lazily than the idea that people simply lived in filth and scarcely noticed. The reality was more complicated, and in some respects more revealing. Medieval people did notice dirt, smell, stale air, foul water, spoiled food, and the discomfort of an unkept body. They noticed because these things touched daily life constantly. What they lacked was not awareness, but the infrastructure and scientific framework that would later make cleanliness more effective, more regular, and more hidden inside systems of pipes, drains, soaps, laundries, and heated water. They understood that certain conditions felt bad, looked bad, and often seemed to lead to bad outcomes. But they did not possess a modern bacteriological map telling them exactly why. So bodily maintenance existed as a kind of practical, moral, and medical activity all at once. Washing could be about comfort, appearance, status, ritual purity, or health. Clean linen could be prized not merely because it looked respectable, but because it felt better against the skin and was associated with decency and order. Fresh air mattered. Ventilation mattered. Bathing mattered in some places more than modern stereotypes allow, though access, custom, and frequency varied sharply by class, region, season, and century. The medieval body was not ignored. It was managed within limits, and those limits are where the hidden reality sits. Take bathing, for example, a subject that has suffered badly from oversimplification. There were public bathhouses in many medieval towns at various times, domestic washing practices in households that could manage them, and strong associations between warm water and bodily ease. People did bathe. They washed hands, faces, feet, and sometimes much more. Aristocratic households could arrange fuller washing with basins, jugs, cloths, and servants. Even poorer people, when water, fuel, and time allowed, valued the refreshment of cleaning the body. The problem was not indifference. The problem was that full bathing required labor. Water had to be fetched, heated, carried, and disposed of. Privacy could be limited. Weather mattered. Fuel mattered. A body that wanted comfort was dependent on systems of work that themselves produced fatigue. There was also ambivalence. Warm baths could be associated with health, pleasure, luxury, weakness, danger, or even moral suspicion depending on context. Medical thinking sometimes regarded bathing as beneficial in certain circumstances and risky in others, especially if the body was thought to be too open, too weak, or exposed to harmful air afterward. This is a useful reminder that medieval body care was not arbitrary. It was reasoned through a framework that linked pores, heat, moisture, digestion, and external environment. The logic may not align with modern physiology, but it was still logic. A body was not treated as a sealed machine. It was thought to be porous, impressionable, deeply affected by weather, food, emotion, and surroundings. Clothing, too, formed part of this bodily management. Linen undergarments were especially valued because they could be washed more readily than heavier outer garments and because they sat directly against the skin. In some ways, clean linen functioned almost like a substitute for the modern ideal of constant full-body cleanliness. Changing it, airing it, drying it, and keeping it as fresh as possible was part of maintaining bodily order. Of course, this depended on means. Linen had to be owned, washed, dried, and mended. The poor possessed fewer changes, and laundering itself was brutal work. To wash clothing thoroughly meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing, wringing, lifting, and drying in conditions not always suited to the task. So even here, what looks to us like a matter of hygiene was also a matter of physical strain. The laundress, the servant girl, the wife with raw hands and aching shoulders from rinsing cloth in cold water, belongs as much to the history of illness as the patient in bed. Cleanliness was labor-intensive, and labor itself damaged the body. That is one of the recurring ironies of the medieval world. The very actions that kept discomfort at bay could produce new discomforts of their own. Soap, water, ash, lye, scrubbing boards, lifting wet linen, standing for hours, exposure to damp and cold. These all took a toll. When we imagine medieval care, we should not think only of remedies and prayers. We should think also of hands chapped from washing, backs strained from carrying, and the quiet exhaustion of those who kept households physically tolerable. Food preparation belonged to the same category of daily maintenance. A great deal of medieval health, or poor health, emerged not in moments of treatment but in the constant task of making food edible, digestible, and safe enough. Grain had to be stored as well as conditions allowed. Bread had to be baked. Meat, where available, had to be salted, smoked, or consumed before spoilage set in. Milk turned quickly. Ale had to be brewed. Pottage simmered. Herbs were added not only for flavor but often because they were thought to aid digestion or balance qualities in the body. The kitchen was therefore a place where health was continuously negotiated, even though it was also a place of burns, smoke inhalation, repetitive labor, and endless standing. Medieval medicine placed enormous emphasis on digestion, and this too is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as quaint. People noticed, very reasonably, that what entered the body had powerful effects on comfort, mood, strength, bowel function, sleep, and disease. They may not have described metabolism in modern terms, but they knew that badly chosen food could make a person heavy, sluggish, overheated, constipated, or ill. Regimen literature for the well-off often discussed foods according to qualities. Hot, cold, moist, dry, easy to digest, difficult to digest, suitable for youth, dangerous for age, proper in winter, less suitable in summer. Much of this sounds foreign, yet underneath it lies an intuitively recognizable observation. Bodies respond differently to food depending on condition and context. For the poor, however, there was often limited room to act on such advice. Choice shrank under necessity. A hungry person could not always select the most balanced meal for their humor and season. They ate what was available, what was affordable, what was left. This is another place where medieval bodily care reveals the divide between prescription and experience. Learned texts might recommend moderation, proper combinations, suitable wines, carefully chosen meats, and measured portions. But moderation is easier to practice when food is abundant. For many, the real challenge was not excess but insufficiency, monotony, or poor quality. Digestive pain in the medieval world did not emerge only from gluttony, as some moral writers warned. It also emerged from shortage, stale provisions, rushed eating, contaminated food, and the body's repeated effort to extract strength from too little. Water, of course, sits at the center of many modern assumptions about medieval health. Here, too, the reality is subtler than the broad caricature. People did not universally drink filthy water because they were careless or ignorant. They were often highly alert to the qualities of water, whether it was stagnant, flowing, foul-tasting, warm, cold, convenient, or suspicious. Wells, springs, streams, conduits, and stored water all had different reputations. Town authorities in some places made real efforts to protect or regulate water supply. But water was hard to control fully, especially in crowded settlements where animals, industry, waste, weather, and sheer human density all affected the environment. The problem was rarely a total absence of concern. It was the difficulty of maintaining purity consistently in a world without the technologies that make clean water seem, to many modern people, almost natural. And because clean water was uncertain, other drinks mattered. Ale, in particular, could form a regular part of diet, sometimes weak and everyday, sometimes stronger, depending on context. This was not necessarily because medieval people preferred intoxication to water, but because brewed drink could be safer or more reliable in some settings, and because it supplied calories as well. Again, however, there is no single medieval rule. Practices differed regionally and socially. What matters most is to notice how closely health was tied to ordinary domestic systems. A body's comfort depended on who brewed well, who stored grain properly, who kept vessels reasonably clean, who fetched from the safer source, who noticed the first sign of spoilage. Air, too, remained central in both theory and experience. We have already touched on smoke and miasma in relation to disease, but even apart from epidemic fear, medieval people sought environments that felt healthier. A room might be aired if possible. Bedding might be dried in the sun. Herbs or flowers might be used not simply decoratively but because pleasant smells were associated with health and corruption with danger. Doors and shutters could be opened or closed with an eye toward drafts, damp, and season. None of this created a modern sanitary interior, but it shows that people were actively trying to shape the sensory climate around the body. Comfort and health were not separate goals. A room that smelled less oppressive, a bed that felt drier, a garment that no longer clung with sweat or grime. These were small acts of bodily mercy. Sleep hygiene, if we may use the term cautiously, had its own medieval forms as well. People recognized that sleep could heal or weaken depending on timing, environment, and constitution. Too much sleep could be criticized. Too little sleep could be blamed for poor health. Sleeping immediately after a heavy meal might be discouraged. Position, bedding, warmth, and emotional state all mattered. Of course, much of this advice collided with reality. A laborer cannot always decide on ideal sleeping conditions. A mother with an ill child cannot simply arrange better rest. But the fact that such recommendations existed at all reveals a world deeply attentive to daily bodily rhythms. This attentiveness extended to evacuation and bodily wastes, matters most modern viewers would rather pass over quickly, though medieval life allowed no such luxury. Constipation, diarrhea, worms, urinary pain, incontinence, and the management of chamber pots or privies were part of ordinary existence. These conditions could be humiliating, painful, socially awkward, and medically dangerous. They could also be revealing. The body's outputs were read as signs of health, imbalance, or disease. This is another place where modern people sometimes underestimate medieval observational skill simply because the conclusions drawn were framed differently. Stool, urine, appetite, and vomiting were not embarrassing side notes. They were meaningful bodily evidence. When a healer asked questions, these were often the kinds of questions that mattered. The physical environments used for waste disposal varied enormously. Rural life, town life, wealth, building type, and local systems all shaped the experience. Some places had relatively organized latrines or drainage arrangements. Others relied on much more exposed and unpleasant methods. Smell, insects, seepage, and contamination were part of this world, but so was maintenance. Someone had to empty, scrape, clear, or manage these spaces. Once again, bodily health rests on unseen labor. One can almost trace a whole hidden history of medieval pain through the bodies of those who performed unpleasant maintenance. The cleaners, carriers, diggers, washers, and attendants whose work reduced discomfort for others while deepening their own exposure. Sexual health and reproductive management also lived inside these ordinary systems of bodily care, though the evidence is sometimes scattered and filtered through moral writing. Medieval people understood, in varied and imperfect ways, that sexual behavior affected the body. Learned medicine often considered the timing, moderation, and physical consequences of sex within broader regimen. Religious teaching shaped what could be spoken openly and what was condemned. Yet beneath these layers, people still had actual bodies with actual desires, pregnancies, miscarriages, infections, exhaustion, and postpartum pain. Women especially bore the intimate physical consequences of this world. Pregnancy was not an occasional exceptional event. For many, it was a recurring bodily condition threaded through youth and adulthood, with all the nausea, strain, danger, blood loss, and weakness that entailed. Postpartum recovery deserves a moment of quiet attention here, because it reveals the medieval relationship between bodily maintenance and bodily demand with unusual clarity. A woman might be expected to rest after childbirth, and in some settings there were customs recognizing a period of confinement or reduced activity. But expectation and possibility were not the same thing. In a household under pressure, recovery could be shortened by necessity. Other children still needed care. Food still had to be prepared. Water still had to be carried. Linen still had to be washed. If there was no servant, no female kin nearby, no extra money, then the recovering body returned to labor long before it was truly ready. The pain that followed might not enter any chronicle, but it belonged to the structure of medieval life as surely as any plague. Children, too, were subject to regimes of bodily management, though these could be inconsistent and deeply shaped by status. Swaddling, feeding, sleeping arrangements, herbs, charms, prayers, and folk remedies all formed part of early care. Some practices may now appear uncomfortable or misguided, but they were not random. They arose from attempts to shape fragile bodies toward health and order. Infants cried, failed to thrive, developed fevers, rashes, bowel troubles, coughs, and all the ordinary vulnerabilities of childhood. Parents and caregivers responded with whatever materials and knowledge they possessed. The tragedy, of course, is that even devoted care often ran up against harsh biological and environmental limits. There is also a moral dimension to all this maintenance. Medieval Christianity linked bodily discipline with virtue in numerous ways. Gluttony, sloth, lust, and excess were not just sins of the soul. They had bodily consequences. Fasting, restraint, confession, and regulated living could be described as spiritually healthy and physically appropriate. Yet here too the lived reality was complex. Severe fasting might weaken some bodies, particularly women in religious life already prone to austerity. Ascetic discipline could shade into self-harm. A regimen praised in spiritual literature might be unbearable for a laboring body. This tension between ideal discipline and bodily need is one of the deeper contradictions of the age. The body was to be governed, but it was also fragile. It required control, yet it also required mercy. Mercy, perhaps, is the right word for many of the smallest daily acts that medieval people used to soften suffering. A warm drink, a stool placed near the fire, extra straw beneath aching limbs. Poultice changed patiently. A child carried so swollen feet could rest. A cloth laid over the eyes. A room darkened. A softer crust soaked in broth for an old person with poor teeth. These gestures are easy to overlook because they rarely appear dramatically in records. But they may be among the truest signs of how people lived with illness. Grand cures were rare. Small mercies were constant. And those mercies matter because they reveal that bodily maintenance was not only a technical question. It was relational. Someone had to notice that the old man could no longer chew hard bread. Someone had to see that a woman after birth could not stand long without pain. Someone had to smell the wound, hear the cough worsen at night, understand that the child's fretfulness was hunger rather than bad temper, or know that the recovering laborer needed another few days before lifting sacks again. Medieval health, such as it was, existed partly in these acts of recognition. Not perfect recognition, not always successful, but human attention directed toward a suffering body. That human attention also helps explain why medieval people could be both more physically intimate with discomfort and, at times, more tolerant of it than modern people would wish. If pain is common, one does not always dramatize it. One learns thresholds. One decides what can be borne, what requires help, and what must simply be folded into the day. This was not stoicism in the romantic sense. It was often necessity. Yet necessity shapes culture. It shapes what is spoken aloud, what is minimized, what is honored, and what is silently endured. By the late medieval period, anyone who had lived long enough had likely developed a complex private map of the body. Which foods to avoid, which seasons to fear, which pain meant danger, which pain meant ordinary labor, which cough could be ignored, which swelling could not, which remedy helped a little, and which priest, neighbor, midwife, or healer one trusted when the line between discomfort and danger began to blur. And that line blurred often, especially in the mouth, the gut, the skin, and the joints, those quieter frontiers of medieval suffering where daily maintenance could fail by degrees. A missed washing, a spoiled cask, a damp bed, a cut from a tool, a winter without enough fuel, a diet thinning toward deficiency, a tooth left aching too long. None of these sounded dramatic on their own. But together they formed the slow machinery by which ordinary life tipped, again and again, from discomfort into illness. And it is there, in those small bodily borderlands, that the next part of this story begins to sharpen. In the specific torments people carried in their teeth, their stomachs, their skin, and their bones, and in how something as seemingly minor as an abscess, a rash, or a bowel complaint could quietly become one of the defining miseries of a medieval life. That in those small bodily borderlands, medieval suffering became especially intimate, because this was where a person might still appear outwardly functional while privately enduring pain that shadowed every meal, every night's sleep, and every task requiring patience. It is one thing to imagine dramatic disease descending upon a household. It is another to imagine the misery of waking each morning with a tooth that throbs before breakfast, a stomach that tightens after coarse food, a rash that stings under wool, or knees that must be bent and straightened 100 times before midday. The hidden reality of illness is often not the rare crisis, but the way lesser torments settle into the structure of a life until they begin to feel, in some quiet and terrible sense, normal. The mouth is perhaps the most revealing place to begin, because dental pain compresses the whole problem of medieval medicine into one small, exquisitely vulnerable part of the body. Teeth wore down not only from age, but from the ordinary textures of life: coarse bread, grit from milling, repeated chewing of tough food, and the general absence of anything like reliable dental prevention as modern people would recognize it. Cavities existed. So did broken teeth, inflamed gums, loosened roots, abscesses, foul breath, and the slow collapse of chewing function over time. None of this required a diet filled with refined modern sugar to become common. It required only the stubborn fact that teeth, once damaged, were difficult to save. And toothache has a cruel way of shrinking the world. A laborer may continue to work with an aching back, because movement at least distracts the mind. But a bad tooth follows a person into speech, eating, sleep, prayer, cold air, and silence. Can make the jaw feel hot and heavy. It can send pain upward into the head and downward into the neck. Can turn chewing into caution and swallowing into frustration. If infection sets in, the face may swell, fever may follow, and the body's distress becomes visible to others. Medieval remedies for dental pain ranged from herbal rinses and poultices to cauterizing procedures, pressure, fumigation, and eventually extraction where possible. Some offered real temporary relief. Some merely shifted suffering from one form into another. Extraction itself, when attempted, was an event of endurance. The idea of a rotten tooth being removed before it poisoned the rest of the body was not irrational. In many cases, it may have been the best option available. But the act of pulling a tooth in a world without modern anesthetic, antiseptic technique, and reliable instruments made even a sensible solution a trial of nerves and pain. One can imagine the scene easily enough. Someone seated or held steady, the jaw already inflamed, the practitioner working quickly if skilled, less quickly if not, the patient bracing against the surge of pain and the sickening sense of pressure deep in the face. Even successful extraction left a wound. Unsuccessful attempts could splinter teeth, worsen infection, or leave behind deeper suffering. And beyond individual pain lay the social consequence of poor oral health. Missing teeth altered speech and appearance. Foul breath could embarrass or isolate, especially in close domestic and religious settings. Difficulty chewing changed diet, which in turn affected strength, digestion, and recovery from other illness. An elderly person with failing teeth might survive on softened bread, broth, ale, pottage, and whatever else could be swallowed with minimal effort. This is one of the ways small bodily failures cascaded into larger weakness. A tooth is never only a tooth when the body lives near the edge of subsistence. From the mouth, it is a short step to the gut, another deeply private region where ordinary medieval discomfort could become relentless. Stomach pain, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, worms, intestinal cramping, and what we might now call chronic digestive disorders were not unusual intrusions. They arose from spoiled food, nutritional monotony, contaminated water, parasites, fasting, stress, overwork, poor teeth, and the general instability of diet across seasons and classes. Medieval medical thinking paid close attention to digestion because everyone could observe how often the process went wrong. A body that digested badly felt weak, heavy, bloated, painful, or unclean. Appetite could vanish. Bowels might not move properly, or they might move too urgently and too often, bringing dehydration and exhaustion in a world where restoring balance was difficult. There is something particularly exhausting about bowel-related suffering because it turns the body into a source of uncertainty and embarrassment at once. A person with recurrent looseness of the bowels could not travel, work, or pray with ease. A child with worms might complain of stomach pain, poor sleep, irritability, or gnawing hunger that never quite translated into flourishing. Constipation, too, could be punishing, especially for the elderly, the weak, and women after childbirth. Medieval remedies included laxative herbs, dietary adjustments, oils, warmed preparations, and recommendations about movement and regimen. Some would have helped, others would not. But the larger point is that digestive distress was not a minor inconvenience in this world. It was a central and repeated form of suffering. Even simple meals could become sites of negotiation. Food had to be chosen not only according to availability but according to what the body would tolerate. A person might learn, through painful repetition, that certain foods brought wind, heaviness, looseness, or sharp pain. Another might avoid cold foods in winter, rich foods in heat, stale bread when the gums were bad, or certain vegetables when the stomach was already unsettled. In a better provisioned household, such adjustments might be possible. In a poorer one, they might not. And that gap between knowing what hurts and being forced to eat it anyway belongs to the daily tragedy of medieval illness. It is the same gap that appears whenever knowledge outruns means. The skin, meanwhile, carried another entire geography of discomfort. The medieval body was covered, rubbed, chilled, heated, bitten, scratched, and exposed to materials that could soothe or inflame. Wool against irritated skin could become an ongoing misery. Flea bites, lice, scabies-like infestations, fungal problems, eczema, ulcers, boils, rashes, chafing, and infected scratches could all turn the surface of the body into a field of constant irritation. Modern people often underestimate how psychologically draining skin pain and itching can be. Unlike a wound that rests beneath clothing, an irritated skin condition travels with every movement. It distracts prayer, sleep, work, and conversation, can humiliate as well as hurt. Boils and abscesses deserve special attention because they reveal how a very local problem could grow into a serious threat. A blocked gland, an irritated follicle, a small infected point under the skin might begin as tenderness. Then came swelling, heat, pressure, and the distinct misery of pain that feels trapped. Clothing rubs against it. Sleep becomes awkward. Fever may follow if the infection deepens. At some point, the boil must either come to a head, drain, or be opened. Medieval households and practitioners had many ways of trying to draw infection outward, soften tissue, or encourage rupture. Warm poultices, salves, compresses, lancing, and cleansing preparations might all be brought to bear. Some were genuinely useful in limited ways. But the discomfort of waiting, of living with pressure building inside the flesh, must have been one of the era's most familiar private agonies. Ulcers, especially on the legs or feet, were another punishing form of ongoing pain. Poor circulation, injury, infection, repetitive friction, and general bodily weakness could all contribute. A sore that would not heal threatened mobility. A leg ulcer in a walking society is not a small matter. Changes pace, posture, and work. It stains cloth. It smells. It requires dressing and redressing. It frightens the sufferer because its refusal to close suggests that the body's own powers of repair are failing. Medieval practitioners attempted to classify wounds and sores with considerable seriousness. They knew some were good in the sense of healing cleanly, while others were dangerous, angry, corrupted, or prone to spreading. The language differed, but the observation was sharp. And then there were the joints and bones, which for many people formed the bass note beneath all other discomfort. Repetitive labor left marks slowly and then all at once. The knees of those who bent, lifted, climbed, and knelt for decades did not remain silent. The hands of spinners, carpenters, masons, cooks, scribes, and launderers each developed their own forms of fatigue and pain. The shoulders of those who carried yokes, pails, sacks, and children adapted by thickening into chronic strain. The back, that common site of modern complaint, was no less central then. But without supportive furniture, targeted physiotherapy, or effective pain management, medieval back pain could become a slow, resentful companion that simply had to be worked around. Cold amplified all of it. Dampness amplified all of it. Age amplified all of it. A joint that could be tolerated in summer became stubborn in winter. A shoulder that managed farm work in youth became unreliable in middle age. An old fracture that had once healed enough began to announce itself with weather changes and fatigue. Here again, medieval people likely possessed detailed private knowledge of their own symptoms. A person knew which season hurt, which movement caught, which hour of the day brought stiffness, which old injury woke in the rain. This sort of bodily forecasting is not exotic. It is deeply familiar. What changes in the medieval setting is not the sensation, but the scarcity of tools for easing it. Some sought relief in warming, sitting close to the fire, applying heated cloths, using oils, resting stiff limbs when possible. Others relied on massage, rubbing, stretching-like motions, or simple household wisdom about keeping joints moving before work began. Learned medicine might interpret joint pain through humoral imbalance, age, accumulated cold, or retained matter. Folk explanation might differ, but both worlds recognized the plain fact of pain in the limbs. And because the sufferer still had to work, what mattered was not whether the explanation was elegantly correct. What mattered was whether the body could get through the day. Eyes and ears, too, belong in this map of ordinary pain, though the suffering they caused could be more subtle. Eye strain in poor light, smoke irritation, infections, age-related dimming, and accidental injury all threatened a person's relationship to the world. An eye that waters constantly, sees only hazily, or reacts sharply to light is not merely an inconvenience in a manuscript culture, a domestic interior lit by flame, or a workshop with flying debris. It is a daily obstacle. Ear pain, infections, partial deafness, ringing, and imbalance could likewise isolate and distress. These conditions are easy to overlook because they do not always announce themselves dramatically, but they change the texture of life. They make conversation tiring, prayer difficult, labor hazardous, and solitude heavier. Head pain also runs quietly through the medieval experience. Headaches from hunger, dehydration, smoke, sleeplessness, fever, bad teeth, eye strain, grief, and tension were almost certainly common, though not always described in language modern people would neatly classify. A pounding head in a noisy yard, a cold church, or a bright summer field could make the world feel intolerably sharp. Some remedies aim to cool the head, purge excess, rest the body, or soothe the senses. Again, we should resist the temptation to sneer simply because the theory differs from ours. Many people in every age seek the same basic things when the head hurts: darkness, quiet, coolness, warmth in the feet, a light stomach, and time. Time, however, was often the one remedy least available. That is perhaps the central cruelty linking all these pains together. Many medieval ailments were not beyond relief in principle. What sufferers lacked was the ability to withdraw long enough for relief to matter. A swollen knee improves with rest, but rest may threaten the household. An infected hand might heal if kept clean and unused, but unused hands produce no bread. Digestive upset settles with gentle diet, but gentle diet may not exist. Skin irritation eases with clean, soft, dry cloth, but the body owns only rough wool and one worn shift. This is why medieval illness can feel, from a modern perspective, like a history of constant near-miss. People often knew the body needed gentleness. Life simply offered too little of it. The poor endured this most sharply, but even rank could not guarantee comfort. Elite bodies could become trapped in their own refined miseries. Gout-like pain from diet and age, swollen legs from inactivity or circulation problems, kidney stones, melancholic collapse, elaborate regimens that disciplined appetite but did not restore ease. The nobleman groaning with podagra in a richly appointed chamber, and the peasant woman rubbing her raw wrists after laundering belonged to different worlds. Yet both knew what it meant for the body to become an obstacle to thought. Pain, whatever else it does, narrows attention. It makes philosophy harder. It makes prayer shorter. It makes patience expensive. This narrowing of attention may help explain why even small bodily comforts mattered so intensely. Softened bread for bad teeth. A warm drink for a cramping stomach. Fresh linen against irritated skin. A stool placed to ease swollen legs. Herbs carried for smell and reassurance. Oil rubbed into sore hands. The sharing of simple remedies between neighbors. These were not trivial matters. They were techniques of livability. In a world where cure was often uncertain, livability was a worthy goal in itself. And the people who possessed reputations for easing such daily miseries were often valued accordingly. Not every trusted healer was a university-trained physician. Many were women whose practical knowledge lived in kitchens, gardens, birthing rooms, and beside sickbeds. They knew which herbs soothed bellies, which washes calmed skin, which foods were tolerable after fever, which poultices softened swellings, which teas encouraged sleep, and which old household measures were useless. Some of this knowledge was empirical, some symbolic, some regional, some inherited from written tradition. All of it belonged to the lived archive of medieval pain. When official sources overlook such figures, daily life becomes harder to see. But without them, the suffering of ordinary bodies would have been even more unmediated than it already was. Of course, practical knowledge could mingle with superstition, prayer, charms, and dangerous guesswork. A person in pain rarely draws tidy lines between acceptable and unacceptable hope. This is especially true when the ailment feels humiliating, repetitive, or resistant. Chronic rashes, persistent bowel troubles, recurring tooth pain, strange swellings, and unexplained weakness invite experimentation. The medieval world offered many forms of it. Some were harmless, some soothing, some costly, some deceptive, and some harmful. Yet even failed remedies teach us something. They show how urgently people wanted not immortality, but relief from the body's smaller, meaner torments. There is an emotional realism here that long-form history can recover better than shorter, more dramatic accounts. The medieval world was not miserable every hour. People laughed, worked, worshipped, loved, feasted, and found pleasure. But bodily pain sat close to all of that. It interrupted pleasure, conditioned endurance, and sometimes determined mood more than grand events did. A person's year might be remembered not only by the harvest or the feast day or the Lord's decision, but by the winter cough that never quite left, the abscess that burst at last, the tooth that had to come out, the rash that spread, the swelling in the knee after rain, the child's stomach trouble, or the old mother's increasing difficulty swallowing coarse bread. And because these miseries were so ordinary, they also shaped compassion. A neighbor who had known toothache would understand the drawn face of another sufferer. A mother familiar with bowel troubles in children would recognize the signs sooner. An old man with joint pain might pity a younger laborer newly injured. Shared suffering did not always produce kindness, but it often produced recognition. The medieval world could be harsh in judgment and tender in practice, sometimes in the same household. That is one of the reasons it resists caricature. Bodies hurt, and people adapted emotionally as well as materially. The more closely we look, the more illness begins to appear not as a separate category from life, but as one of life's organizing conditions. It determined who could work, who married, who traveled, who prayed standing rather than kneeling, who ate what, who was thought strong, who needed help, who feared winter, who dreaded childbirth, who could endure fasting, and who became dependent earlier than expected. Pain was not merely experienced. It structured choices, sometimes quietly, sometimes decisively. And nowhere did that structuring force become more emotionally charged than in the body's most intimate thresholds. childbirth, infant frailty, reproductive strain, and the kinds of pain that were expected precisely because they were so common. For many medieval women especially, ordinary suffering was inseparable from the cycles of menstruation, conception, labor, blood loss, nursing, and recovery. What sounds in a record like a brief mention of a difficult birth or a sickly infant often concealed weeks of exhaustion, fear, tearing pain, fever, weakness, and the knowledge that the body would soon be called upon again. It is there, in that deeply gendered landscape of pain, that the next part of this history begins to draw closer. It is there, in that deeply gendered landscape of pain, that the next part of this history begins to draw closer, because for medieval women the body was often treated not as a private possession but as a site of expectation. It bled, conceived, carried, fed, recovered, and was then expected very often to begin again. This did not mean that every woman's life unfolded in the same way. Class, region, fertility, marriage, celibacy, health, and sheer chance shaped experience enormously. But across much of medieval society, female pain was made ordinary by repetition. That may be the most revealing and unsettling truth of all. A suffering repeated often enough does not become lighter. It simply becomes expected. Menstruation itself belonged to this world of expectation, though the physical experience must have varied as much then as it does now. Some women would have passed through each month with manageable discomfort. Others would have known cramping, weakness, headache, back pain, digestive upset, irritability, dizziness, or heavier bleeding that made labor and daily obligation harder to sustain. Medieval medical theory had much to say about menstrual blood, female balance, conception, and bodily regulation, but those theories sit beside a simpler reality. A woman could be in pain and still have to fetch, carry, knead, wash, nurse, or serve. Menstrual suffering, like so much female pain in history, was seldom dramatic enough to halt expectation, yet often significant enough to shape the day. The same can be said of pregnancy, which in later romantic imagination is sometimes folded too easily into soft-focus images of motherhood, devotion, and continuity. In practice, pregnancy meant a body becoming heavier, less certain, and more vulnerable in a world not designed to lighten the load. Nausea, breathlessness, swelling, poor sleep, constipation, altered appetite, pain in the hips and back, fatigue in the legs, anxiety after previous losses, and the constant risk of something going wrong. All of these must be brought back into view if we are to understand medieval illness honestly. Even a wanted pregnancy, welcomed by family and necessary to household continuity, could be a season of discomfort shadowed by fear. And fear was not irrational. Childbirth in the medieval world was common, but common is not the same as safe. That distinction is essential. Modern viewers sometimes hear that birth was an ordinary domestic event and assume this meant it was calm, natural, or socially well-contained. In one sense, it was ordinary. Women had given birth for generations. Midwives and experienced female relatives possessed practical knowledge. Rituals, preparations, prayers, and customs surrounded the event. But ordinariness does not cancel danger. It can merely hide it beneath familiarity. A birth room could hold both competence and dread at once. Everyone present might know what usually happened. The problem was that what usually happened could change very quickly. The birthing chamber itself was often an intensely female space, especially in the earlier and central stages of labor. Men might be absent or kept at the edge. Women gathered around the mother, supporting, encouraging, preparing cloths, water, food if possible, and the countless small acts that make bodily crisis more bearable. This practical female world is one of the great undercurrents of medieval life, frequently obscured by male-written records yet essential to everyday survival. Women learned from other women how to manage pain, how to read signs of progress, how to position the laboring body, how to calm fear, when to wait and when to worry. This knowledge was not always written in learned Latin, but it was knowledge all the same. Labor pain itself must be imagined not only in physical but in social terms. A woman in labor did not suffer alone in the modern individualized sense. She suffered under watch, surrounded by helpers, kin, witnesses, perhaps prayer, perhaps worry, perhaps the memory of earlier births, perhaps the memory of children lost. Her pain belonged to her body, but its consequences belonged to the whole household. Would she live? Would the child live? Would there be tearing, bleeding, fever after? Would milk come? Would another mouth survive to need feeding? In that sense, childbirth condensed many of the central pressures of medieval life into a single room. Bodily vulnerability, family continuity, communal care, and the constant possibility that hope might turn, very suddenly, into mourning. When birth went relatively well, there was still the aftermath. This too is often flattened in popular imagination, as though the successful appearance of a child resolved the crisis. In truth, the body after childbirth could be sore, weakened, torn, bleeding, feverish, swollen, and deeply depleted. A woman might have labored for hours or days. She might have lost blood. She might be expected to nurse almost immediately. Her abdomen would remain painful, her sleep interrupted, her emotions strained by exhaustion and survival. And in a better provisioned household, she might receive a period of lying in, a temporary withdrawal from ordinary duties, richer foods, warmth, support, and female attendance. But the gap between ideal recovery and actual recovery could be immense. Poorer women often had less time, less privacy, less help, and less nourishing food with which to rebuild strength. This is where medieval reproductive pain becomes especially revealing, because it was not limited to the dramatic threshold of childbirth. It continued afterward in the long, wearing work of postpartum weakness. A woman still bleeding or healing might be expected to rise too soon. She might carry a baby while other children tugged at her skirts. She might return to the yard, the fire, the wash, the field edge, or the market before the body had regained even a fraction of what it had lost. That early return to necessity was not a moral failing by the family or the woman. It was often economics, plain and cruel. The household could not suspend itself for long. Bread still needed making. Water still needed carrying. Animals still needed tending. And so the recovering body, still sore and unstable, moved back into labor. Nursing added another layer. Breastfeeding could bind mother and child intimately, nourish the infant, and, in some circumstances, delay conception for a time. But it could also be painful, draining, and uncertain. Cracked nipples, mastitis-like infection, engorgement, exhaustion, anxiety over milk supply, hunger sharpened by the energy demand of nursing, and the simple fact of repeated waking all belong to this history. Wet nurses existed in some settings, especially among elites, but for many women feeding the infant meant their own body remained in service without pause. And when the mother herself was underfed or weakened, the relationship between infant survival and maternal pain became even more precarious. Miscarriage and stillbirth, though harder to document fully in emotion, must also have been frequent presences in this world. Here the pain was layered. Physical cramping, bleeding, weakness, risk of retained tissue or infection, and grief that may or may not have found full public expression depending on custom and circumstance. A woman who miscarried did not simply lose a pregnancy in the abstract. She endured it in the body. And because medieval communities were accustomed to reproductive uncertainty, there may have been practical knowledge surrounding such losses, yet familiarity never removes sorrow. It only embeds sorrow more deeply into ordinary life. When childbirth became obstructed or otherwise life-threatening, the limits of medieval medicine were exposed with particular force. Midwives could reposition, encourage, support, and use experience to guide ordinary labor. But some births defied household skill. A child might not descend properly. Labor might continue too long. Bleeding might become catastrophic. Fever might follow delivery. In those moments, the birthing room shifted from expected hardship into emergency, and the emotional temperature of the household must have changed with it. Priests might be called. Last rites might hover at the edge of hope. The child might be baptized in haste if survival seemed uncertain. The mother herself might know, with terrible clarity, that the familiar pain of labor had become something else. This is one of the most difficult historical truths to sit with calmly. Childbirth was neither a rare heroic exception nor a safely ritualized event. It was a common passage through danger. That phrase matters because it helps explain how medieval society could speak of motherhood with reverence while also absorbing maternal suffering as structurally ordinary. A woman might be praised for fertility, devotion, endurance, or piety, but praise did not reduce the cost paid by the body. Nor did the successful birth of several children guarantee that later births would be easier. Experience brought knowledge, yes, but it also brought cumulative wear. The body remembered. That bodily memory probably shaped the emotional life of many medieval women more than grand public events ever did. The fear of the next labor, the fatigue of repeated pregnancies, the grief of a lost infant, the sensation that one's own strength had never fully returned after the last birth before the next conception began. We should be wary of projecting modern interiority too confidently into the past, but we should be equally wary of denying medieval women interior lives simply because the record is uneven. A woman who had buried one child and carried another while nursing a third did not need modern vocabulary to understand strain. She lived it. Infants themselves belonged to a world of bodily fragility from the beginning. The first weeks and months of life were perilous, and families knew it. A child might seem strong at birth and then fail to thrive. Fever, diarrhea, respiratory infection, malnutrition, congenital weakness, accidental suffocation in shared sleeping spaces, and a dozen other dangers hovered near the cradle. This knowledge shaped emotion. Modern people sometimes assume that because infant death was more common, attachment must have been thinner. The evidence does not support such easy distance. Parents named, nursed, prayed over, baptized, mourned, and worried for their children. High mortality did not prevent love. If anything, it likely sharpened the anxious tenderness of care. That care, however, unfolded inside material limits. Swaddling could protect, restrain, warm, or perhaps sometimes hinder. Sleeping arrangements were shaped by space, cold, and need. Feeding could become a daily calculation of supply, health, and survival. A weak child required more attention precisely when the mother might be recovering, underfed, or already responsible for others. And again, the caregiver's pain and the child's vulnerability interacted. The body of the mother, the wet nurse, the grandmother, or the older sister could become the buffer between infant life and infant death. Medieval childcare was therefore inseparable from women's bodily labor. Children who survived infancy entered another demanding phase of embodied risk. They were not wrapped in a long protected childhood as later idealized family models might suggest. They crawled, fell, burned, cut themselves, swallowed bad food, developed rashes, fevers, and bowel complaints, and, as soon as age and custom allowed, began to take on work. Their bones were still growing, their immunity still developing, their understanding still partial. Yet the world around them remained full of fire, water, animals, tools, ladders, carts, and infection. Childhood pain in the medieval world was not only disease. It was also accident and labor. A child could be useful and vulnerable at the same time. Adolescence, especially for girls, brought another tightening of bodily expectation. Menstruation began. marriage might approach. Fertility became a matter not only of personal destiny but of family strategy, economic stability, and social standing. A young woman's body was thus interpreted through future reproduction even before it had fully ceased being a child's body. Early marriage in some settings meant early pregnancy, which in turn could intensify danger. A young body not fully matured may have faced particular risk in childbirth, though the exact age patterns varied widely by place and class. What matters here is the atmosphere of anticipation surrounding female embodiment. Pain was not only something suffered when it arrived. It was something many knew might be waiting just ahead. This helps explain why women's healing networks mattered so much. Male physicians appear more often in prestigious texts, but the intimate management of reproductive pain often depended on midwives, mothers, aunts, neighbors, and female religious communities. They understood not only the mechanics of childbirth as best they could, but the rhythms of bleeding, the exhaustion of nursing, the soreness of breasts, the symptoms that frightened and those that merely discouraged, the difference between ordinary labor pain and something that felt fatally wrong. In a world with limited formal medicine, such recognition was itself a form of protection. It could also become a form of authority. Midwives occupied a complicated position in medieval society. Trusted, necessary, sometimes respected, sometimes monitored, sometimes suspected, depending on place and period. They entered the most intimate threshold between life and death. They handled blood, fear, cries, and decisions that men might hear about only afterward. The existence of that role alone tells us something fundamental. Medieval society was patriarchal, certainly, but it was also forced, by the realities of the female body, to rely on women's embodied expertise in moments when abstraction was useless and practical presence meant everything. None of this should make the birthing room sound serene. It could be tender, but it could also be crowded, hot, frightening, exhausting, and loud with pain. The air might smell of sweat, blood, heated water, damp cloth, herbs, wax, and fear. The laboring woman might move, kneel, brace, lean, cry out, or sink into silence. The attendants might encourage, pray, wipe, hold, massage, wait. Time might stretch so long that everyone present became uncertain whether events were progressing or turning toward disaster. And in those long stretches of uncertainty, one sees again the central feature of medieval illness. Not always catastrophe itself, but the absence of control over when suffering would stop. It is worth noticing, too, how the theology of pain interacted with these intimate realities. Christian tradition could frame childbirth pain through Eve, sin, punishment, redemption, endurance, maternal sacrifice, or providence. These narratives gave meaning, but meaning could cut more than one way. It might console some women, helping them place suffering within a cosmic story. Yet it might also normalize pain so thoroughly that relief became morally secondary. A woman's agony could be acknowledged, blessed, prayed over, and still expected. This is another of the era's quiet contradictions. Spiritual meaning dignified suffering while also, at times, hardening the culture around it. And yet women were not only passive recipients of this order. They navigated it, interpreted it, complained within it, helped one another within it, and carried practical knowledge forward through it. A woman who had survived 3 births with tearing and fever might advise a younger relative differently. Another who had lost a child might respond to the next infant's slightest illness with heightened vigilance. One who had nursed through hunger might know exactly which pottage strengthened the body fastest. Lived experience mattered. It formed a second, quieter archive beneath official learning. There is, perhaps, no better example of how medieval pain was both ordinary and profound than the fact that so much of women's suffering was folded into the normal calendar of life. It happened at expected ages, in expected rooms, under expected social arrangements. Yet its emotional and bodily cost remained immense. That ordinariness is the truly hidden part. Histories centered on kings and wars can make the past seem episodic, broken into dramatic events. But much of the medieval world was held together by women enduring recurrent pain without the social permission to treat it as exceptional. And when things went wrong for women beyond childbirth, prolonged bleeding, prolapse, fistula-like injuries, persistent pelvic pain, infections after birth or miscarriage, unexplained infertility, breast infection, or the bodily aftermath of repeated conception, the suffering could become even more isolating. Some conditions were visible, others were humiliatingly hidden. Some might receive sympathy, others might be treated as private burdens to be managed quietly. The medieval female body could therefore be both central to household continuity and strangely lonely in its pain. That loneliness was not total, but it mattered. The same community that gathered around birth might fall silent around chronic reproductive damage. A woman may have remained useful, pious, beloved, and yet still inwardly afraid of her own body. Fear of the next pregnancy, fear of bleeding too much, fear that weakness would be interpreted as laziness, fear that infertility would carry blame, fear that nursing would fail, fear that pain long after childbirth meant something permanently broken. These are not melodramatic inventions. They are simply the probable emotional shadows cast by the physical realities we already know were present. And as children grew inside these households, watching women carry, feed, bleed, recover, and sometimes die, they learned very early what bodies cost. Medieval illness was taught as much by observation as by instruction. A girl saw what labor did to women. A boy saw how many household decisions bent around maternal weakness or infant need. A family learned to read feverish faces, crying newborns, milk-starved infants, and the stooped gait of women who had risen too soon after delivery. Reproductive pain was therefore never merely individual. It shaped the memory and expectations of the whole household, which is why, as we move forward, the story naturally widens again. Because if the household was the first great theater of medieval pain, it was also the place where children learned how to inhabit illness, how to interpret suffering, and how to care for bodies that could not be separated from labor, hunger, weather, and fear. And once those children grew into adults, carrying their own scars, losses, and bodily habits with them, they stepped into a wider communal world where pain was not only domestic but public, visible in streets, markets, churches, fields, workshops, and among the poor who had the fewest protections of all, visible in streets, markets, churches, fields, workshops, and among the poor who had the fewest protections of all, pain became part of the public language of medieval life. A household might hide certain sufferings out of modesty, fear, or simple habit, but the larger community still encountered the damaged body everywhere. The limping man at the market stall, the woman pausing too long beneath the weight of a water vessel, the beggar with a bandaged leg, the coughing laborer at the church door, the child with a swollen face from bad teeth or infection, the old widow moving slowly along the lane with eyes that no longer judged distance well. These were not unusual figures on the margins of history. They were woven into the everyday sight of towns and villages. And once we understand that, medieval illness begins to look less like a hidden subplot and more like one of the visible structures of society itself. This is where poverty becomes impossible to separate from pain. Not because wealth abolished suffering, as we have already seen it did not, but because poverty stripped away the buffers that made suffering easier to survive. The poor slept in tighter quarters, wore rougher cloth, owned fewer changes of linen, ate less varied food, had less access to fuel, were more exposed to weather, and possessed fewer ways of withdrawing from work when the body began to fail. Even a relatively minor illness could become more serious in these conditions, not necessarily because the disease itself was more dramatic, but because the body had less reserve with which to meet it. The poor were not merely more likely to become sick. They were more likely to remain sick, to worsen, and to suffer the economic punishment of illness at the same time. A day laborer with a fever might lose a week's wages and then discover that the weakened body returning to work could no longer keep pace. A widow with children might continue lifting and washing through pain that would have sent a wealthier woman to bed. An apprentice with an infected hand might delay treatment because he could not risk appearing unreliable to a master. A servant in a great household might be nursed when useful and replaced when not. Medieval communities did practice charity. Almsgiving, parish support, hospital foundations, confraternities, and private acts of mercy all mattered. But charity did not remove the central fact that illness exposed the poor to a steep and often immediate descent into worse vulnerability. The street itself could become a map of that descent. Begging in medieval society took many forms, and the poor sick were among those most likely to appear in public precisely because illness had pushed them there. Some were elderly. Some were visibly disabled. Some were women with children. Some were temporarily ruined by accident, wound, fever, or failed harvest. Their bodies became part of the moral and visual life of the town, confronting passers-by with the Christian duty of almsgiving and with the more uncomfortable reality that any stable household might slide toward the same condition through a sequence of bad seasons, bad luck, and bad health. Medieval pity was therefore not always abstract. It often met the eye in limping, coughing, swollen, bent, and visibly hungry forms. And yet pity was never the only response. Public suffering could also attract impatience, suspicion, fatigue, or fear. A person who begged too often, smelled too strongly of illness, or seemed contagious could be avoided as much as aided. The poor sick lived at the intersection of compassion and anxiety. They reminded the healthy of moral duty, but they also reminded them of bodily fragility and economic precarity. This tension is deeply human and not unique to the medieval world. What is distinctive in the medieval setting is how little institutional cushioning existed between the suffering body and public exposure. There was no broad welfare system to absorb misfortune before it became visible. Pain emerged into the street more quickly. Hospitals, where they existed, offered some response to this problem, though not in the form many modern listeners may imagine. Medieval hospitals were often places of mixed purpose: shelter, charity, hospitality, religious care, and sometimes treatment. They might receive the poor, the sick, the elderly, travelers, pregnant women in distress, or those too weak to manage elsewhere. Some were attached to religious houses. Others were urban foundations supported by guilds, lay benefactors, or civic authority. Their quality and function varied widely. A hospital could be a place of relief, prayer, order, and modest comfort, or it could be crowded, under-resourced, and unable to do much more than supervise the passage from illness to death. Still, even that limited support was significant. To be given a bed, broth, washing, attendance, and spiritual care was no small thing in a society where domestic households were often overwhelmed. The existence of such institutions tells us that medieval people recognized illness as a social problem, not only a private misfortune. They may not have possessed modern medicine, but they did possess a moral imagination in which the sick poor required organized response. This is one of those places where the medieval world is both harsher and more humane than stereotype allows. Harsh because resources were so limited and suffering so constant. Humane because whole institutions could be built around the duty not to leave the weak entirely alone. Inside those institutions, the experience of pain must have been strangely mixed. There was relief in no longer struggling entirely by oneself. There was also the discomfort of lying among others equally frail, hearing coughs, groans, prayers, restless movements, and perhaps the sounds of dying nearby. Medieval care was rarely private in the modern sense. Even the hospital sickbed belonged to a collective environment in which one person's illness became part of another's atmosphere. The air carried smell, fear, and resignation. Yet it may also have carried comfort, because the patient suffering in company was still suffering among witnesses rather than in utter abandonment. The church, too, remained a public setting where pain could be seen, interpreted, and shared. Medieval worship was embodied in a way difficult to forget once one starts paying attention to it. People stood, knelt, processed, fasted, rose early, went on pilgrimage, confessed weakness, sought healing through prayer, and entered sacred space with bodies that ached. The old leaned, the injured paused, the sick asked for prayers. Relics associated with healing saints attracted those desperate for relief from blindness, lameness, fever, infertility, seizures, or wounds that would not close. Some cases were framed as miraculous cures. Others may have involved temporary improvement, hopeful interpretation, or the emotional force of communal belief. What matters here is not to decide which medieval healing accounts meet modern standards of proof. It is to understand how powerfully people wanted the sacred to touch the body. Pilgrimage, in particular, reveals the layered character of public pain. For some, it was an act of devotion, thanksgiving, penance, or petition. For the ill, it could become a journey structured around hope. Hope that a saint's shrine might relieve suffering that ordinary remedies had failed to move. But pilgrimage also imposed hardship. Roads were uneven, weather uncertain, inconsistent. Food and safety could vary. A person already weak, lame, or feverish might worsen on the road before arriving at the very place where healing was sought. That paradox is deeply medieval. The route to relief could itself be painful. Yet people still undertook it because pain without hope is harder to endure than pain shaped by destination. Markets and workshops offered another kind of public education in suffering. In towns especially, labor was visible. One saw the swollen hands of smiths, the bent backs of porters, the smoke-reddened eyes of cooks, the scarred arms of butchers, the stiff movement of older craftsmen whose skills remained sharp even as their joints failed them. Apprentices learned not only a trade but the bodily cost of a trade. They saw which masters limped, which coughed, which drank for pain, which could no longer lift as before, which relied on younger hands for the heaviest tasks. Illness was therefore also a lesson in time. The younger body was shown every day what later years might feel like. This is one reason medieval work should be imagined not only as productivity but as attrition. To labor was to spend the body. Some spent it in the field, some at the bench, some over the fire, some at the wash, some on the road. The forms differed, but the principle remained. Medieval economies were powered by muscle, repetition, weather, and endurance. There was no easy separation between the human frame and the work it performed. When the body hurt, the economy hurt. When the economy demanded too much, the body recorded the demand. And because labor was so visible, pain was visible too, even when no one named it dramatically. The fields, perhaps more than anywhere else, reveal the slow public nature of bodily decline. Agricultural work required crouching, lifting, carrying, cutting, walking, pushing, and bending again. Seasons concentrated effort. Harvest did not wait because knees ached or the back had seized. Women labored there as well as men, and children too as soon as they were capable. A field full of workers was therefore also a field full of private discomforts being temporarily subordinated to necessity. The romantic pastoral image of medieval agriculture obscures this entirely. The landscape might be beautiful from afar, but inside it were blisters, heat exhaustion, sun, wind, aching shoulders, sore feet, and the quiet anger of bodies driven beyond what they would have chosen. It is not difficult to imagine how this shaped temperament. A population accustomed to regular bodily discomfort would develop habits of speech and silence around pain. Some complaints might be voiced freely because everyone understood them. Others might be restrained because constant complaint served no purpose. People learned when to ask for help, when to keep moving, when to fear a symptom, and when to treat it as another day's burden. This practical literacy in suffering may be one of the most important mental differences between the medieval world and our own. Not that medieval people felt less pain. They almost certainly felt more of it. But they lived in a culture where pain more often had to coexist with function. There is, however, an important reversal here. Constant exposure to pain did not necessarily make people indifferent to it. In some cases, it may have made them more observant. A community that has watched many people worsen knows the signs of dangerous change. The old woman at the door may notice that a child's rash is not like the usual rash. A midwife may see that the labor is wrong in its rhythm. A smith may recognize from experience that a cut has gone beyond the stage of ordinary healing. A parish priest may hear in a confession not only spiritual fear but bodily decline. This kind of embodied knowledge rarely produces grand historical headlines, yet it is one of the things that made medieval communities survivable at all. We can see it as well in the treatment of the destitute sick. When charity was offered, it often took the form of very practical support. Food that could be swallowed by weak mouths, fire for warmth, cloth for bandaging, a place near the hearth, a bed, a ride, a messenger sent for a priest or healer, someone to watch through the night. These are modest interventions, but modest interventions can mean everything when pain has already eroded dignity. The medieval world could be cruel to the poor, but it also preserved traditions of bodily mercy that were intensely concrete. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, bury the dead. The physicality of those obligations tells us something about the physicality of suffering itself. At the same time, public pain could become spectacle in uncomfortable ways. Executions, punishments, and judicial mutilation belong to the medieval landscape too, and though they form a different category from illness, they shaped how communities saw the suffering body. People were accustomed to reading scars, missing limbs, branded flesh, and publicly inflicted wounds as social signs. This did not mean they confused punishment with disease, but it did mean that bodies in pain were often interpreted through moral frameworks. Illness might be seen as misfortune, judgment, trial, or mystery. Visible damage might invite pity or suspicion depending on context. The body in public was never merely biological. It was legible in social and moral ways. That helps explain why some forms of illness carried stigma beyond the pain itself. Skin disease, visible deformity, chronic discharge, foul-smelling wounds, wasting, and conditions associated with sexual behavior or divine displeasure could make a person socially difficult to approach. Leprosy, again, is the most famous example, though modern people must be careful not to project one single experience across all medieval cases. Different diseases were sometimes grouped under the same label, and responses varied by region and institution. But the broader principle stands. Certain illnesses disturbed social confidence because they altered the body so visibly and persistently. The sufferer endured not only pain but altered status within the eyes of others. And status mattered enormously. A noble with a chronic illness might still be surrounded by attendants, carefully dressed, spoken to with courtesy, and physically protected from public degradation. A poor person with the same visible symptoms might lose work, attract fear, or be pushed toward charity, wandering, or institutional care. The body itself may have hurt similarly. The social meaning of that hurt did not. This is one reason a trust-building history of illness has to keep returning to class. It is not enough to ask what conditions existed. One must ask whose pain became survivable, whose became public, and whose was allowed privacy. Privacy, in fact, may be one of the most underestimated luxuries in the medieval history of pain. To be ill privately, to suffer in a quiet room with clean cloth, adequate food, and one's weakness shielded from public exposure, was itself a kind of privilege. Much of the poor sick did not possess it. Their pain spilled into common rooms, shared beds, workspaces, roads, doorways, and institutional wards. Their weakness became visible to creditors, neighbors, employers, passers-by. Modern people often think first of medicine as the great dividing line between past and present, but privacy may be nearly as important. The ability to suffer without immediate social consequence transforms what suffering feels like. Still, even where public life exposed pain, it also created collective habits of response. Guilds could support members. Religious fraternities could accompany the dying or bury the poor. Neighbors might pool food or take in children when illness shattered a household. A town might fund a hospital bed, regulate burial, or attempt sanitation measures during crisis. These were not comprehensive protections, but they were real. And perhaps the fairest way to see them is this: medieval society did not solve bodily vulnerability, but it developed moral, communal, and institutional techniques for standing near it. Some of those techniques were deeply imperfect. Hospitals could become overcrowded. Charity could be selective. Public suspicion could fall cruelly on the visibly ill. Women's suffering could be normalized. The poor could be blamed for conditions created by poverty itself. Yet none of this cancels the fact that medieval people knew the sick required more than ideas. They required food, cloth, fire, water, prayer, witnessing, and time. The repeated return of those basics across the centuries is almost moving in its honesty. When medicine cannot cure much, care is forced to reveal its more elemental form. And here the story bends once more toward the senses, because public pain was not only seen. It was heard. The cough in the alley, the groan in the church porch, the child crying through the wall, the old man breathing hard on the bench outside, the bell tolling too often, the whispered rumor of who had taken to bed. Medieval towns and villages were acoustically intimate places. Illness entered common awareness through sound as much as sight. In such worlds, no household suffering remained entirely sealed. Community was partly made of overheard weakness. It was smelled as well. Workshops, kitchens, animals, drains, wool, would smoke, tanneries, streets, sweat, sickness, and the poor combined into urban and rural atmospheres that modern people can only partly reconstruct. Within them, the smell of a bad wound, stale bandages, feverish bedding, unwashed bodies, or infected rooms would have carried clear meaning. People noticed such changes. They may not have named microbes, but they knew when a place smelled wrong, when a body smelled worse, when danger seemed to thicken in the air. Public life trained the senses to become instruments of health judgment. All of this means that medieval illness was never just something that happened in the abstract interior of the body. It happened in relation to roads, markets, hearths, bells, churchyards, workshops, and shared rooms. Pain had geography. It clustered where labor was hardest, where air was foulest, where bodies were closest, where food was poorest, and where weather bit deepest. Once one starts noticing those geographies, the entire social map of the medieval world changes. Prosperity and misery are no longer just matters of property or rank. They are matters of how much pain a body could absorb before the surrounding world became unlivable. And yet, for all this public visibility, some of the most consequential pain remained half-hidden inside social expectations. The servant who kept moving because she dared not stop, the apprentice too afraid to admit worsening weakness, the widow working through a fever because children still needed bread, the old mason pretending the dizziness would pass, the parish poor maintaining outward decency until the body failed in full view. Medieval life contained countless such thresholds where private endurance tipped into public breakdown. That moment of tipping, when ordinary suffering could no longer be concealed or managed, was often the moment when the community finally intervened. Which leads us toward another important question. If medieval society saw pain everywhere, if it responded to it through charity, religion, household knowledge, and patchwork institutions, then how did people themselves explain to one another why some bodies failed earlier, why some pains lingered, why certain trades damaged the body in one way and others in another, and why so much suffering seemed tied not only to disease but to environment, work, and season? Because the more carefully one listens, the clearer it becomes that medieval people were not simply enduring pain blindly. They were building theories about it from everything they could see around them. And in that effort, however incomplete by modern standards, there was something profoundly human. Medieval people did not live inside chaos. They lived inside explanation. The body was thought to respond to heat and cold, wet and dry, age and season, diet and labor, sorrow and desire, place and air. A person's suffering might be traced to corrupted humors, to bad food, to God's will, to overwork, to poor sleep, to damp lodgings, to grief, to bad water, to inherited weakness, or to the simple wearing down that comes from years of bodily use. Modern medicine would sort these causes differently, with more accuracy in some areas and more technical precision in almost all. But what matters, as this long quiet descent through medieval pain has shown, is that people were trying to make suffering legible. And when we step back from the details, from the aching tooth, the swollen knee, the infected cut, the laboring mother, the hungry child, the coughing old man, the poor woman rising too soon after birth, the beggar in the churchyard, the exhausted healer at the bedside, a larger truth comes slowly into view. The hidden reality of medieval illness was not only that life could end suddenly or painfully. It was that life was so often lived under strain. Pain was ordinary without being trivial. It was expected without being easy. It was everywhere, and yet people still loved, worked, worshipped, laughed, repaired roofs, baked bread, buried the dead, planted next year's grain, and carried one another through bad nights into difficult mornings. That may be the deepest correction to the shallow version of this history. Medieval life was neither a fantasy of noble hardship nor a non-stop theater of grotesque misery. It was something more sobering and, in a strange way, more intimate. A world in which the body was fragile, exposed, and frequently in pain, yet still the vessel through which all ordinary life had to pass. There were no clean separations between health and economy, pain and prayer, childbirth and danger, work and injury, poverty and disease, private suffering and public life. Everything touched everything else. A rotten tooth could alter diet. A bad harvest could deepen weakness. A difficult birth could rearrange a household. A winter cough could become widowhood. A small wound could become a funeral. And a little relief, a warm room, a cleaner cloth, a better broth, a neighbor's help, could feel almost as meaningful as cure. Perhaps that is why the medieval world can feel unexpectedly close to us once the costume and distance fall away. Beneath the strange theories and unfamiliar rituals lies a deeply recognizable human pattern. People trying to live decently in bodies that hurt more often than they wished, and with fewer remedies than they needed. They learned the weather of their joints. They feared certain seasons. They read one another's faces for signs of fever, swelling, exhaustion, and grief. They passed down practical knowledge. They argued about causes. They sought help in herbs, hands, prayer, institutions, saints, surgeons, and whatever fragments of hope the world allowed. They were not ignorant of suffering. They were experts in enduring it. And there is something quietly moving in that expertise. Not because pain ennobles people automatically. Often it merely tires them, narrows them, frightens them, and makes them irritable or desperate. but because even within that exhaustion, medieval people kept building habits of care. They carried broth. They changed linens. They stood beside laboring women. They gave alms to the sick poor. They opened hospitals. They recorded remedies. They watched for danger in the body's signs. They buried the dead with whatever dignity conditions allowed. Their medicine was limited, their explanations uneven, their losses frequent. But their attention to suffering was real. If there is one image to leave with, it may not be the dramatic one most people expect. Not a king dying of plague, not a surgeon with iron tools, not a public procession of penitents, though all those things belong to the age. It may instead be the more ordinary scene that sat beneath them all. A dim room at the edge of evening, a body trying to rest despite pain, another body nearby tending the fire, adjusting cloth, offering water, listening to the breath, waiting to see whether the night will worsen or ease. That was medieval illness too. Not only catastrophe, but vigilance. Not only suffering, but attendance. And in that attendance lies the final historical takeaway. What people today often misunderstand about that world is not simply how much it hurt, though it hurt a great deal. It is how closely pain and care lived together. The medieval past was harsher than nostalgia admits, but also more observant, more adaptive, and more relational than caricature suggests. It was a world where illness rarely belonged to one person alone. It spread through households, through labor, through poverty, through memory, and through the senses of entire communities. To understand medieval pain, then, is not only to ask what people suffered. It is to ask how they went on, who helped them go on, and what it meant to inhabit a body that could never be fully separated from the demands of history itself. If one detail from this journey surprised you most, or if there is another part of everyday medieval life you would want to drift into next, I'd be glad to hear it. And if you'd like to return for more calm, thoughtful history, you're always very welcome here.